The story begins in a dim forest where thin twisted trees stand with trunks bent like bony fingers while dark mold and moss cover the ground. Dark leaves drift through the air beneath a cloudy murky sky. This forest is filled with bizarre monsters that do not exist in reality. A purple monster lies over a young man and bites toward him while a knife is stabbed into the monster's neck and blood spills from the wound. The young man lies on the ground under the monster's jaws with saliva dripping over his face and says, "Damn it." The monster's huge mouth opens wide above the young man's head with rows of sharp teeth and its tongue hanging down toward him. Blood splashes through the air as he says if he dies here everything ends. The young man jerks upright in a bed as he wakes from the dream. He grips his throat and breathes heavily and says 12 years have already passed since the pain began that feels like he is actually dying. He rests his cheek on his hand with tired eyes and says the damn dream again. Power lines stretch between poles above buildings under a bright daytime sky. He holds a pen and writes notes in a notebook while sketching a small monster figure on the page. He pushes his chair back and rises from the desk with one hand on the table and says he can endure the pain of dying. He stands barefoot in the center of a cluttered room filled with books, papers, and equipment and stares ahead. He looks downward with exhausted eyes and says sleep is the most painful and that he is so damn tired. A monster bites into his neck as blood sprays across his shoulder while he says every time he falls asleep in reality he is sent back to the nightmare world. A sword pierces his torso and blood bursts from the wound as he collapses backward while saying if he dies in the nightmare world he is sent back to reality. He sits hunched on the bed clutching his stomach and breathing heavily because he cannot get a proper night's sleep. He glares forward with tired eyes and says fuck. He crouches in tall grass wearing a hood and gripping a sword after spending 12 years mastering weaponry, martial arts, swordsmanship, jungle survival, and military tactics to stop dying in the nightmare world. He moves through the grass with his sword held low and his cloak trailing behind him as he looks back startled. He drives his sword downward into a monster's head and blood sprays from the impact while saying because of his training he now dies less often in the nightmares. He stands in his room with one hand pressed to his temple beneath shelves filled with books and boxes. He presses his fingers against the side of his head and says the fundamental problem is sleep. A doctor sits behind a desk with her hands folded and says to try to find something he wants to do and then he might be able to get a good night's sleep. He stares forward with tense eyes and says something I want to do. He stands in the middle of a cluttered room facing tall shelves filled with books and boxes and says the only thing he wants to do is just fall asleep. He tilts his head slightly upward with his eyes closed and says he just wants to sleep soundly even if just once. Blood drips from his nose and mouth. Blood pours from his mouth as he grips his throat and says ah. His eye stares forward in shock as he says what is this? He falls to the floor and lies face down in a large pool of blood. He lies on the floor with his cheek pressed into the blood while it smears across his mouth and chin and he says his body feels light and the persistent headache is gone. A wide open meadow stretches under a bright blue sky and fresh air fills his chest and head and for the first time in 12 years he feels like he actually slept well. An eye-shaped opening shows treetops and sky as he wonders if he actually died. The view through the opening shows trees and cloudy sky as he wonders what this place is. The protagonist sits leaning against the massive roots of a large tree in a misty forest. He stares upward with wide eyes and realizes this is the nightmare world he suffered in for 12 years. He suddenly turns his head with a startled expression. A large reptilian monster with multiple eyes sticks out its long tongue behind the tree while the hooded man presses his hands against the sides of his hood. The multi-eyed reptilian monster opens its mouth with its tongue hanging out as it stares forward. The protagonist presses his shoulder against the tree and looks to the side while realizing he lost a large amount of blood. His body lies on the floor with his cheek pressed into a pool of blood and he realizes he might really be dead. The protagonist sits on the thick roots of the giant tree and lowers his head. He stands in front of the massive roots and accepts that if he dies here there is no reality to return to. He stares forward with wide eyes and declares that this place is now his reality. Reptilian monsters stand near the tree looking sideways while he remains above on the roots and says he knows what kind of place this is and what he must do to survive. The protagonist narrows one eye beneath his hood and decides he should not fight right now and instead head toward a bright place that monsters hate. He lowers his chin slightly beneath the hood and stays silent. He pulls a large curved sword from his waist and a sharp metallic sound rings out as he questions the strange feeling in his body. The protagonist suddenly leaps forward with the sword raised and declares he does not want to run away while the reptilian monster looks up with wide eyes. He stands holding the sword at his side and wonders if the strange feeling comes from sleeping deeply for the first time in ages or from this younger body. A large reptilian monster charges across the ground toward him while he stands facing it with the sword ready. The monster's multi-eyed head rushes forward with its jaws wide open and saliva flying. He tightens both hands around the sword hilt as his body screams at him. The protagonist lowers his head beneath the hood with a sharp glare and declares that he will fight and survive. His blade slices across the reptilian monster's body and tears through flesh as blood sprays outward. The protagonist looks back over his shoulder as blood splashes across his cloak and face. The monster's clawed foot slams into the ground and dirt and debris burst outward. The monster's body jerks backward as blood pours from the deep wound across its torso. The monster collapses backward while he stands holding the sword at his side with blood dripping from the blade. Several bright pillars of light descend from the sky. The protagonist kneels with his sword planted into the monster while another monster's head lies in the foreground. His blade cuts into the monster's stomach as he reaches inside to pull out its core. He holds a glowing monster core in his gloved hand and looks down at it with a calm expression. The protagonist raises the core to his mouth. He bites into the core as blue liquid bursts into his mouth and blood runs from his lips. He stands with his sword at his side in the forest while a dead reptilian monster lies in the foreground. Blood covers his mouth and chin as his red eye glows, and he declares that in this dark fantasy world he will survive no matter what. The protagonist walks through the forest between massive tree roots. Sunlight pours through the forest canopy as bright beams of light reach the ground. The protagonist stares forward with a serious expression and says first to a brighter place. He sits calmly on a thick tree branch with his sword resting across his shoulder as sunlight filters through the leaves. Leaves drift slowly through the air as the forest sways in the breeze. The protagonist closes his eyes for a moment. A faint smile appears on his lips. He stretches his arm with a relaxed grin and remarks that it is another night of perfect sleep. Leaves continue drifting across the sky. The protagonist swings his curved blade through hanging vines while saying it has been a month since he crossed over here. He looks forward beneath his hood and explains that even though he continues moving from the pitch-black darkness toward the light, just because he feels like fighting now does not mean he goes hunting. He reflects that risking his life for fun is madness as a bat-like monster feeds on a corpse in the forest. The protagonist watches from behind a large tree and admits he cannot help feeling the urge to fight. He lowers his voice and says the only time he hunts is when he needs food, then realizes he is getting hungry. In a flash of motion he swings his curved blade and slices through the monster. A glowing blue core sits inside the monster's body as he says another reason to hunt is to obtain new power. The protagonist bites into the blue core as liquid spills from it. He wipes his mouth and explains that eating these gives him a chance to gain the monster's power. He sits quietly against a tree and thinks that ever since he started eating them, adapting to this place has become easier. He reaches toward his belt and recalls another fact he discovered. The protagonist pulls out a metal token and realizes this body seems to belong to someone with the status of a third-class mercenary, and he notices he can read the writing engraved on it. The token hangs from a cord as the words third-class mercenary echo in his mind. His eyes widen in a close view. He sits beside a tree looking forward as he realizes that the existence of a token like this means people must be living somewhere in this world. Sunlight pours through the trees ahead and he exclaims that he can see the light. His expression changes as he suddenly notices something unusual. The protagonist looks down at the ground in surprise and asks what that is as a line of sharp metal spikes lies hidden in the grass. A metal bear trap with jagged teeth lies open on the ground and he exclaims that it is a trap. He turns his head with a tense expression and says that means something. The protagonist leaps forward through the forest with his cloak trailing behind him and says there might be people nearby. Bright sunlight shines through the trees ahead. He stands in the clearing and looks down toward a small wooden house. His eyes widen as he looks forward and says it is a house. The protagonist raises his fist and knocks on the wooden door, then opens it while asking if anyone is there and if no one is home. He stands inside the house and looks toward a table where a book rests. He reaches out with his gloved hand and places it on top of the book, saying this is something. The protagonist holds the open book with both hands and looks down at its pages, saying it is called Demonic Realm Chronicles. His eye widens and a drop of sweat appears on his face as he stares at the book in shock. He leans forward while holding the open book and says the history of this place and the terms used are recorded quite meticulously. The protagonist stares ahead with a serious expression and says that for him to survive in this world this book is absolutely necessary. A boot suddenly presses against the wooden floor with a sharp sound. An older man appears from behind with a crossbow aimed at him and asks who he is. The older man keeps the crossbow aimed forward and says to answer clearly or he will put a hole in his head. He looks to the side with a faint smile and says he is glad to see a person but wonders if the man mistakes him for a robber. The protagonist raises his gloved hand toward the older man while the crossbow remains aimed at him and says not to misunderstand, explaining that he entered the remote house out of curiosity. The older man glares forward and tells him to get lost, saying he has no business with him. The protagonist stands beside the table with the book lying in front of him and says he understands. His gloved hand presses down on the cover of the book as he speaks. The protagonist holds the book in both hands and asks if the man could lend it to him because he wants to read it, adding that he will pay a price if needed. The older man narrows his eyes and asks what if he refuses. The protagonist looks forward with a tense expression and says he absolutely needs this book to survive here. He pulls a dagger from his waist as his cloak shifts and says in that case. He stares forward with glowing red eyes and says he might just become a robber. The protagonist holds the dagger in a tight grip while facing the old man, who keeps the crossbow aimed at him. The old man aims the crossbow straight ahead with a steady gaze. The protagonist narrows his glowing eye and says he does not know how strong the old man is, but he does not feel like he would lose. The old man's mustache shifts slightly as his expression softens. He stands in the doorway with the crossbow lowered at his side and says a robber would not talk about wanting to read a book. He introduces himself as Hector. The protagonist looks forward with a sharp expression and says the man lowered his guard while introducing himself as Kim Woo-jin. Hector rests the crossbow on his shoulder and strokes his beard while saying Ji Mu Jai is quite a peculiar name. Jean stands nearby and asks him to just call him Jean. Jean looks to the side with a tense expression and a drop of sweat on his cheek and says his name must be hard to pronounce. A gloved hand holds the thick book while Hector says he understands, but the book is precious to him and cannot be lent out. He says Jean can stay here for a while and read it. Hector leans forward and gestures with his hand while saying he wants Jean to help with simple chores in return. Jean holds the book to his chest and thanks him. A small wooden house sits quietly behind a fence while mist drifts through the trees around it. A pot of soup boils over a small fire as pieces of vegetables float in the broth, and Jean ends up staying at Hector's house. Hector is gruff but does not seem like a bad person. Hector sits at the table eating from a bowl and tells Jean to eat up. Jean sits at the table holding a bowl and spoon while staring at the warm soup and says it has been a long time since he had something warm to eat. Jean lifts a spoonful of soup to his mouth and eats while tears run down his cheek. He says it is delicious and that Hector might be an angel. When the sun rises, Hector goes out hunting. Jean sits at the table holding a mug and asks if Hector is going out today too, and Hector says it might take a while. Hector looks ahead with a stern expression and says he is going to take revenge on the monster that killed his comrades. Jean holds his bowl and looks down with a serious expression and says Hector looks strong, so seeing him nervous means the enemy must be powerful. Jean looks toward the open doorway while holding the bowl and says it must be a considerably powerful monster. Hector walks away from the house with a crossbow and gear strapped to his back. When Jean is alone, he sits at the table and reads the chronicles. All stories begin with the Northern Empire as a great castle burns on a cliff while soldiers stand below with raised spears. The king of the Northern Empire, blinded by greed, reaches toward a glowing otherworldly gate. The king opens the otherworldly gate, said to hold the truth of all creation and immense power, as red light pours out over him. On that day the calamity begins as countless glowing eyes appear within a dark opening. Powerful monsters pour out from the otherworldly gate and spread across the land, turning the north into a demonic realm in 9 years. Humanity unites many factions to form the Order Alliance, and the Alliance builds a barrier to stop the spread of the demonic realm. Jean closes the book resting on the table with his hand. He rests his chin on his hand and murmurs in thought that there is a lot of useful information, but something still bothers him. Jean sits at the table with his hand on the book and says the deeper you go into the demonic realm, the stronger the monsters become. He wonders if the monsters became weaker as he moved toward the light. Hector runs across the grass with a crossbow in his hands as wind trails behind him. Jean rests his hand against his mouth and looks forward with a serious expression while wondering how deep inside the demonic realm he had been wandering. Hector runs forward with wind whipping around him as he moves at high speed while Jean wonders how strong he is in this place. Several wolf-like monsters charge forward through the forest while a large white wolf with glowing red eyes lunges ahead of the pack. Hector lowers his body while gripping the crossbow as he rushes forward. A massive white wolf leaps through the air with its jaws open. Hector's boot slams against the ground as he braces himself. Hector spreads his stance and fires multiple bolts from the crossbow as arrows shoot downward toward the monsters. Several bolts strike the charging wolves as one beast is knocked aside while another continues rushing forward. A wolf with glowing red eyes lunges forward as a bolt breaks in half in front of it. Hector turns with a tense expression and shouts in frustration. Hector runs toward the house while Jean comes out holding a weapon. Jean walks forward holding a large blade in one hand while one of his eyes glows red. Hector runs toward Jean holding the crossbow and shouts for him to run because it is dangerous here. Jean rushes forward with his blade raised as he passes Hector. Hector looks back with wide eyes and sweat on his face. Jean's red eye glows as wind streaks past his face while he rushes forward through the air. He leaps from the ground with a sharp impact. Jean descends from above with the blade raised while a massive white wolf looks up at him. The white wolf rears back with its jaws open and claws raised. Jean drives the blade straight down into the wolf's body as blood bursts outward. The blade splits through the wolf as Jean continues the downward strike. The wolf's body crashes onto the ground while several beasts stand behind it. A large brown wolf lowers its head and bares its teeth while growling. Hector stares forward with wide eyes and sweat on his face and says, "Oh my god." Jean stands with his blade extended to the side as blood arcs through the air and Hector says he took down the werewolf in a single slash. The massive werewolf lies split open on the ground with blood spreading beneath its body. Hector stares at him in shock while gripping the crossbow as Jean calls out Hector's name. Jean looks down with blood on his cheek and asks if this monster is considered strong. Hector faces him and asks if he is asking whether a werewolf is strong. Hector narrows his eyes and answers that it is incredibly strong. Jean looks ahead with a calm sharp gaze and says, "I see." Jean stands facing the pack of wolves with his blade lowered at his side and says he will hear the details after dealing with the rest. Several wolves stand in the forest with their teeth bared. Jean grips his blade and narrows his glowing eyes as he says they do not look that strong and there are about 40 of them, just enough to screw him over if he is careless. Jean lowers his stance and aims his blade toward the pack as he says instead of fighting all of them, he will slice the throat of the one that looks like the second in command and shatter their morale. Jean's eyes narrow sharply. A massive brown wolf with glowing blue eyes stands at the very front of the pack as Jean identifies it as the target. Jean looks forward with red energy flaring behind him and raises the blade overhead as he says it is the first one he needs to kill. The brown wolf snarls and bares its teeth. Jin's red eye narrows sharply as he focuses on the large brown wolf. The brown wolf senses the killing intent and stares back silently as its expression tightens. Suddenly, the wolf's eyes widen in alarm. The brown wolf turns its head while a gray wolf beside it looks confused. The brown wolf suddenly turns and runs back while the gray wolves stare at it in confusion. The brown wolf yelps loudly in shock. A powerful gust of wind spirals through the clearing and scatters leaves as the wolves freeze in fear. Jean stands with his sword while the wolves panic and scatter, running away from him. Hector stares in disbelief and says the wolves ran away, those wolves that are known for their bravery. Jean stands calmly with a thoughtful expression and notes that the wolf sure knows how to assess a situation. The large brown wolf sprints away through the forest. A worn wooden building stands under a dark stormy sky. Inside the house, the body of the werewolf lies stretched across a table while Hector explains that the bounty on the werewolf Jean killed is at least 40 gold coins. Jean touches the corpse and asks if that is a lot of money. Hector answers that it certainly is. Jean looks surprised for a moment as Hector adds that it is enough to live comfortably without working for 6 to 7 years. Jean looks again at the werewolf and questions why such a weak monster would have such a high bounty. He continues thinking that if a trash monster like a werewolf has such a huge bounty. A small smile forms on his face. Jin's lips curl into a faint smile as he thinks that whenever he needs money he can simply hunt and kill monsters like this. He reflects that life here might be easier than the last 12 years. Hector places a small pouch of coins, bundled jerky, and a folded map on top of the werewolf's fur-covered body. Jean sits beside the corpse and looks at the items as he says this is a werewolf pelt while Hector stands nearby holding the map. Hector rests his hands on the werewolf's body and tells Jean to take the map, go to Pioneer Village, and find Jacob at the marked location. The pouch of coins drops onto the werewolf pelt as Jean looks at it and asks if it is okay for Hector to give him something this valuable. Hector looks down toward Jean and says he killed the werewolf so he is simply paying the price and that he also had a grudge against that creature. Hector extends his hand forward. Hector reaches out toward Jean and thanks him for getting revenge for him, adding that he hopes they meet again if the opportunity arises. Their hands clasp firmly together. Jean grips Hector's hand and thanks him for everything. A small wooden house stands quietly at the edge of the forest. Jean walks away from the house carrying the rolled pelt and a sack over his shoulder while Hector stands watching from the doorway. Jean walks down a forest path with the large bundle of pelt strapped to his back and the sack hanging from his shoulder. He turns his head slightly as he walks while a creature stands on top of a rock in the distance. A large beast with long curved horn-like appendages stands on the rock with its head raised. The beast raises its head and lets out a low growl while its blue eye glows. Jean walks toward a large wooden gate where armed guards stand watch as he arrives at Pioneer Village. Jean looks ahead at the settlement and says this is Pioneer Village. Jean stands at the open gate with the rolled pelt strapped to his back while a guard holding a spear faces him, and he notes that the town is quite well stocked for a small place. Jean walks through the village street carrying his bundle while several townspeople turn their heads and stare at him. Jean glances sideways while a group of men behind him watch him closely. Jean walks past a muscular bald man with crossed arms while he thinks that everyone seems on high alert because he is a stranger they have not seen before. People stand along the street watching as Jean walks away with a large pelt on his back, and it becomes clear that in a world like this the thing more dangerous than monsters can be people. A wooden tavern sign with a mug and fork hangs above the entrance. Jean walks into the tavern carrying the rolled pelt and sack while patrons sit at tables drinking and playing cards, and a waitress carries a tray of mugs. Jean walks past the tables while several men glance toward him. Jean sets the large rolled pelt and the sack onto the counter as the bartender looks at him and offers him a beer. Jean looks at the bartender and says he will pass on the drink and instead asks if he knows where he can find a man named Jacob. A man sitting at the counter turns toward him. The man holds a knife and a piece of food and says he is Jacob and asks what he can do for him, while Jean thinks this guy is Jacob and says he has the face of a scammer. Jean turns slightly and says he was sent by Hector, explaining that Hector told him he could sell a werewolf pelt if he met him. Jacob jerks backward in shock as the knife slips from his hand while Jean presses his hand against the rolled pelt on the table, and Jacob shouts in surprise and asks if Hector killed a werewolf. Jacob grabs the large rolled pelt and pulls it closer while Jean watches him, and Jean notes that Jacob assumes Hector killed the werewolf and decides there is no need to correct him. Jacob stares down at the werewolf pelt draped over the table with wide eyes and says it is a real werewolf pelt. Several men stand nearby watching as Jacob holds the pelt, while one man says Hector may have finally done it and adds that even if he is old, Hector is still Hector. Jacob's mouth curls into a grin as he murmurs that this is as expected. Jacob bares his teeth with a fierce grin and says he knew Hector could pull it off. Several men crowd around Jean while one man grips a knife and another clenches his fists, and Jean stiffens in reaction. Jean turns his head sharply toward them and asks what they are doing. Jacob pulls the werewolf pelt over his head like a hood and raises a clawed paw toward Jean while telling him to get lost while he is asking nicely and says he will spare his life. Jean looks toward Jacob and calls him a scammer while asking if he has always done business with this intention when Hector trusted him. Jacob tilts his head with a smirk beneath the werewolf pelt and tells Jean to watch his mouth, saying Hector lived too far away and supplying him caused a loss. Jacob lifts the werewolf paw over his shoulder and grins while saying he needs the pelt to make up for the losses he accumulated. Jean stares forward with a cold expression as his eye glows red, and he questions whether he should kill him before deciding he should not. A hand rests on the table as he says he cannot kill a person over a pelt and calls the man a shitty bastard. Beer splashes across Jean's face as Jacob throws the drink at him. Jacob holds the empty mug beside his face and smirks while telling Jean not to try to be clever and to get lost. Jean sits with his back turned as drops of beer run down his hair and cloak while he remains silent. Jean walks away from the counter while Jacob stands behind him holding the empty mug, and the sack rests on the counter. A mug tumbles across the floor leaving a trail of spilled beer as several armed men stand around Jean with knives in tense stances. Jacob smirks while holding the sack on his shoulder and tells Jean it was a smart choice. Jacob's expression tightens as he notices something and lets out a confused sound. Jean grabs a large wooden table and flips it upward as the furniture lifts into the air. Jean stands with his back toward the room and calls out to Jacob. Jean turns his head with a red glowing eye and says that if someone intended to scam from the start they should have aimed for the neck instead of the back. Jacob's eyes widen beneath the werewolf hood as he exhales sharply and says he takes back what he said about Jean being smart. Several armed men rush forward with weapons raised while Jacob watches from behind and says the kid does not know the value of his life. A man lunges forward swinging a large blade down toward Jean while shouting for him to die. Jean bursts forward with his cloak whipping around him as his eyes glow red, and he says that people like them probably would not make him feel guilty even if he killed them. A man swings his blade downward and Jean ducks low beneath the strike as the weapon slams past him. The attacker grips his sword with both hands and shouts that Jean is strong and fast. Jean lowers his gaze with a cold expression. Jean slashes through the attackers as blood sprays across the floor and one man collapses backward while another leaps toward him. A bald man raises a heavy weapon above his head and swings it down toward Jean. The weapon slams into the floor with a violent impact as debris bursts upward while Jean stands beside him unharmed. Jean drives his shoulder into the edge of a wooden table and pushes it forward. The table crashes into the bald attacker and knocks him backward. The bald man recoils behind the overturned table and mutters in alarm. A blade slices downward through the air toward Jean. Jean lunges forward and slashes upward with his sword as blood sprays across the floor. Jean stands still with blood streaked across his face while his red eyes stare forward. Jacob stares forward with wide eyes as sweat pours down his face and mutters in shock while wondering where such a monster appeared from. Jean crouches among broken furniture and fallen bodies as multiple attackers rush toward him with raised weapons while Jacob thinks a fighter this strong should be known in this area and that at this rate he will die for nothing. An attacker leaps through the air with two blades raised while another swings a fist toward Jean as Jean twists low between them and cuts the leaping attacker in half. Jean slams his elbow into a man's side as the attacker's body jerks from the impact. Jean drives his fist straight into another man's stomach as blood bursts from the wound. A blade sweeps across the air. Jean slices across a bald attacker's torso as blood sprays along the arc of his sword. Jean stands over a fallen man with glowing red eyes while the defeated attacker lies motionless on the floor. Jean with a bloodied cheek stares forward with one glowing red eye while his face remains tense and motionless. Jacob with a terrified expression shouts that everyone should run. Two men inside a wooden house sprint toward the door while one looks back in alarm. A man crashes through the wooden wall and flies outward as broken boards and glass scatter through the air. Jacob lies on the ground staring ahead in shock with his body pressed against the dirt. His eyes widen in fear as he stares forward and shouts in shock. A large red wolf with glowing blue eyes stands with its jaws open and teeth bared as he shouts that it is a red wolf and asks why this monster is in the village. Jean lands behind Jacob with a sword raised while Jacob lifts both hands in panic. The red wolf faces Jean while several villagers recall behind him with their hands raised in fear. Jean stares at the wolf with a questioning expression. The wolf bares its teeth and barks loudly as saliva flies from its mouth. Jean looks toward the wolf and says that it is the scout wolf while the wolf with glowing blue eyes faces him tense and silent. Jin's red eye glows as he stares at the wolf and asks if it came here because it wants to die too. The wolf freezes with its eyes wide and its face stiff. The wolf drops onto the ground, curls its body and lets out a weak whimper. The wolf flips onto its back while panting repeatedly as it lies on the ground in front of Jean. The red wolf rolls on its back in front of Jean while panting heavily and kicking its legs in the air. Three attackers stare at the wolf in confusion while pointing at it with shocked expressions. Jean looks down at the wolf with a puzzled expression and wonders why it is acting like a mutt. The wolf stares upward with wide eyes, sweating and panting with its tongue hanging out. Jean points his finger toward the three attackers as they look startled while the wolf lies on the ground nearby. Jean points directly at the wolf and orders it to bite. The wolf shoots upright with glowing eyes. The wolf lunges forward with its jaws wide open toward an attacker as the man throws up his arms in panic. The wolf slams into the villager and crushes him against the ground as he screams in pain. Blood bursts into the air as the wolf mauls him violently. Jean watches the attack and says, "Oh nice." Jacob staggers backward while staring at the wolf. The wolf bites into a fallen man on the ground while another body lies beside them. Jacob sweats and stares forward in panic as he says he needs to get out of this situation first. Jean glances forward calmly and Jacob says he is a moron. Jacob drops to his knees and bows deeply with both hands raised, saying he will apologize as many times as needed and begging to be spared while promising he will do anything he is told. Sweating, Jacob lowers his head with clenched teeth and says revenge will come after this. Jin's sword drives straight down into the ground beside Jacob's hand. Jacob jerks his head up with wide eyes as blood runs down his forehead. Jean leans forward with both hands resting on the sword's handle while the kneeling Jacob looks up at him and says, "Sir." Jean covers his mouth with his gloved hand and mutters that this bastard thinks he is a pushover. Jean stares down with glowing red eyes and says he is not someone to be taken lightly. In a small office room, a smiling man sits across the table and says he is sorry and asks to let it slide this once. Jean sits across from him at the table while the factory manager tells him the company's situation when he asked about his missing salary. Jean sits in the office with a forced smile and says that back then, because he was soft-hearted, he had no choice but to accept the situation. A calendar's pages tear away as the dates change while he says that once he knelt down, the salary that was a week late was delayed by a month, then two, and at some point. Jean opens the door and raises a hand saying his salary this month is also late while the factory manager swings a golf club. The manager rests the golf club on his shoulder and calls him a punk. The manager shouts that people should stick together when things are tough and calls young people selfish while Jean says he branded him as selfish and treated him like a pushover. Jean stands beside his planted sword while the kneeling Jacob stares up at him and he says living month to month felt miserable. Jean turns away from the kneeling Jacob while saying he learned one lesson back then. The injured Jacob slowly lifts his head with a tense grin. Jacob curls his lips into a twisted grin. He suddenly lunges forward and grabs the dagger from his waist. He leaps into the air behind Jean with the dagger raised and screams for him to die. Jean turns his head with glowing red eyes and swings his hand upward. Jacob brings his blade down as Jean blocks the strike with his hand. Jean glares forward with his sword raised and says people like him who scam others do not know the meaning of remorse. Jacob's face freezes in terror as he realizes what is about to happen. Jin's sword flashes across and cuts off his head as blood sprays into the air. Jacob's severed head spins through the air as blood sprays outward while Jean stands below with his cloak swirling around him. Jean lowers his head with glowing red eyes as blood stains his cloak and says this time he will never be taken for a pushover again. Jean stands over the fallen body while blood splashes through the air. Jean turns his head slightly and says now then. A large wolf stands in front of him with a small pouch hanging from its mouth as he says next is that mutt and asks what he should do with him. The wolf lowers its head and drops the pouch on the ground in front of him as he says it seems the wolf has decided to follow him for now. The pouch lies open on the ground revealing several gold coins inside. Jean slides his sword back into its sheath and looks down. Jean stands facing the horned wolf and asks you want to tag along. The wolf looks up at him in silence. Jean bends forward and places his hand on the wolf's head. His gloved fingers rub the wolf's head as the animal closes its eyes. Jean looks down at the wolf with a faint smile. He pats the wolf's head and says clever thing. Jean stands beside the large wolf and strokes its head while saying let's get along from now on mutt. Rows of rooftops stretch across a settlement beneath a large fortified wall and wooden watchtower. Soft light spreads across the sky above drifting clouds. Jean sits up in bed inside a room while the horned wolf lies asleep on the floor beside an empty bowl. A faint smile forms on Jin's lips as he says it was a perfect deep sleep. The wolf stretches and yawns widely while Jean raises his hand beside the bed and says the morning feels so refreshing he feels like he could fly. Jean sits shirtless on a wooden stool beside a stream washing his clothes in a large basin while water flows nearby. Water drips from Jin's arm as he wipes his face and exhales. He sits on the stool with wet clothes resting on the basin as he says he killed a person for the first time and it was not just one or two but many. Jean sits with his head lowered and stares at his hands and says however he does not feel any guilt. Water drips down his face as he lowers his head and says because they were scum. No, the emotion he felt back then. Killing people feels the same to him as hunting monsters and the moment fills him with excitement as he swings his blade with a grin. He presses his hand against his chest as a quiet buzzing vibration runs through his body. Jean lowers his head and studies his open hand while realizing something inside him is beginning to change. His red eyes glow faintly as he wonders if he might be cursed but accepts that he survived. Jean walks through the forest with the large wolf beside him as he says his life in this world will be completely different and that he will live in abundance instead of a meaningless life. A calm smile forms under his hood as he decides to simply enjoy the present. He approaches the massive walls of the 5th pioneer city with the wolf following behind and says they should sell the pelt first. Jean walks along the path and rubs his temple while telling the wolf to stay nearby and keep out of sight. He walks through the busy street of Pioneer City carrying a large rolled pelt over his shoulder as he heads toward the Order Alliance to claim a monster bounty. He glances to the side while recalling that the chronicles mention a branch of the Order Alliance in Pioneer City. A tall stone tower rises above the Order Alliance building as a clerk stretches and yawns behind the balcony desk. Jean stands at the counter with the rolled pelt on his back and asks if this place is the Order Alliance and the clerk replies that it is and asks what brings him there today. Jean drops the large rolled pelt onto the desk in front of the clerk making him flinch in surprise. Jean faces the clerk and says he came to collect a monster bounty. The clerk grips the pelt and inspects it with a doubtful look and says it is just dog skin and this is not a place for pranks. The clerk's eyes widen as he leans closer to the pelt and suddenly tells him to wait. He grabs the pelt and shouts that it is a werewolf pelt while Jean stands beside the counter watching calmly. Sweat runs down the clerk's face as he stares at the pelt and asks if Jean caught it himself. Jean looks at him and replies that he did earlier. Jean sits alone at a long wooden table inside a large room. A man enters through the door carrying a pouch and apologizes for the wait, explaining they needed time to confirm the pelt was real. A hand sets a heavy coin pouch on the table as the werewolf pelt is confirmed authentic and the reward is given. Jean holds the pouch with both hands and realizes the money is enough to live lazily for at least 6 or 7 years. He opens the pouch and stares at the pile of gold coins in his hands as a trembling runs through him that feels different from when he hunts. A smile spreads across his face while coins spill across his palm as he realizes money is definitely a good thing. He turns his head toward a voice calling out and answers with a questioning look. The man stands in front of him and asks if he would be interested in taking another request because he has a favor to ask. Jean leans forward with a faint grin and repeats a request. The man scratches the back of his head and explains that a monster recently appeared at a nearby quarry and it is causing serious trouble. Inside the quarry tunnel, two workers hesitate at the entrance as red glowing eyes stare from the darkness while it is said the quarry has become dangerous because of monsters preventing bloodstone mining and pushing the city to the brink of ruin. A miner lies on the ground while another man grips a liquor bottle as it is said the monster there is stronger than a werewolf. The man gestures toward Jean and says he believes Jean can handle the job. Jean looks at him and asks what kind of monster it is. A monstrous skull-like creature with glowing red eyes appears in the man's description as he says its name is Mad Skull and that it carries a bounty of 70 gold coins. Jean turns his head slightly as he recalls reading about Mad Skull in the chronicles. A huge skull-faced monster looms over Jean as he faces it with his sword drawn, remembering that it is a creature he has already fought before. Mad Skull has a hardened skull and burning red eyes. The creature's glowing eye glares from the darkness as it shows insane aggression and strength far beyond a werewolf. Jin's eye widens as he remembers that it took him a month to kill the monster the first time because he died about 28 times. The man gestures across the table and asks Jean if he thinks he can subdue the monster. Jean tilts his head slightly and stays silent. His eyes glow red as he smiles and answers, "Of course." The quarry spreads out beneath tall rocky cliffs with mining structures and a dark tunnel at its center. Jean walks along the stone path overlooking the quarry and says the workers could not operate for a while because of Mad Skull. He stands at the quarry entrance and looks toward the dark mine, deciding it is best to finish the job as quickly as possible. Jean walks into the quarry while a man standing nearby calls out for him to wait. A group of men stands ahead of Jean and one raises his hands while telling him they arrived first and were just preparing for battle, asking him to wait his turn. Jean turns back toward the group and thinks about their demand that they want him to leave simply because they arrived first and wonders since when hunting monsters required waiting in line. The red-haired mercenary awkwardly laughs and suggests another option. Jonathan spreads his arms wide in front of Jean and says they could join his team and hunt together. Jean stands still and looks to the side while thinking that if he waits for the mercenary group to finish and they succeed it will be a huge waste of time. Jonathan smiles confidently and gives a thumbs up while saying it might be better to work together. Sweat runs down the face of Jacob standing behind Jean. Jean grips the handle of his sword and says he cannot easily trust the people here, asking why he wants to bring him along when he already has plenty of people. Jonathan scratches the back of his head with an embarrassed smile and says he prioritizes safety over performance. Jonathan faces forward with a calm smile and says it would be a big help if Jean joined them because he seems strong. Jean turns his head slightly and asks why Jonathan suspects that he is strong. Jonathan stands facing Jean and explains that the wolf would not be following him if he were not strong. A blonde woman kneels and holds the wolf's head as it licks her cheek while she says wolf monsters are known for strong independence and it is amazing to see one following a human. Jean stares forward with widened eyes and thinks that he told Mutt to stay hidden. The wolf lowers its head and eats a roasted piece of meat from the ground while the blonde woman kneels beside it and smiles as he says they offered him meat cuisine of this world that even he has not tasted yet. The wolf holds the roasted meat in its mouth and stares forward silently. The roasted meat with a bone rolls across the ground. The wolf crouches while Jean and Jonathan stand looking as a roasted piece of meat drops onto the ground between them. Jean glares forward with a tense expression and thinks about the wolf's behavior. A roasted piece of meat lies on the ground glistening with grease. Sweat runs down Jin's face as he murmurs in confusion. Jean leans forward and looks down at the meat near his foot while questioning why his body is reacting and says that when he thinks about it he cannot remember the last time he had a real meat dish. Jean widens his eye in realization and thinks that a dog had been eating that meat and it was also on the ground. A hand reaches down and presses into the roasted meat on the ground. The blonde woman smiles and holds the roasted meat out toward Jean while asking if he would like some if he is hungry. Jean stares forward with widened eyes and murmurs softly. The blonde woman stands smiling while holding the roasted meat with both hands as glowing light surrounds her and he sees her as a goddess he can trust. Lamps hang along the rocky tunnel walls illuminating the mine interior. Several people walk deeper into the mine tunnel past wooden carts while Jean, the blonde woman, and Jonathan follow behind. Jean holds a piece of roasted meat and eats it while thinking that it tastes delicious. Claire turns her head back toward Jean while walking and says they have not introduced themselves yet. Jonathan points his thumb toward himself and introduces himself as Jonathan, captain of the Black Marlin mercenary group, while the blonde woman says her name is Claire. Jean stands behind them and says he is Kim Woojai but corrects himself and says he is Jean, and Jonathan replies that they are pleased to have him and tells him to ask questions anytime, while Jean answers that he understands. Jonathan smiles slightly as he reacts with surprise and says they have arrived, explaining that this is where they will fight Mad Skull. Inside a large circular cavern, mercenaries spread out along the edge while Jonathan orders the trap team to set up nets and the spear team to move to their assigned positions. Jonathan walks forward with his hand behind his head and asks Claire if they should begin, and Claire answers yes. Jean stares upward with widened eyes as glowing feathers drift around him. Claire floats in the air while holding an open book as green magical light and feathers swirl around her, and Jean wonders if this is magic. Claire points toward a glowing magic circle forming above the open book as Jean realizes this is the magic mentioned in the chronicles. Claire closes her eyes and chants that she asks in her name to send blessings upon this land. Jonathan strides forward with a confident smile as green magical energy and floating feathers swirl around him and Feather Step activates. He looks ahead with a grin and says Claire's buffs are excellent as always. Jonathan runs forward with his arms raised while green energy trails around him, and Claire tells him he has 3 minutes at best and 5 at worst. His boot lands on the ground as swirling green energy surrounds his step, and he tells everyone to stay ready. Jonathan sprints forward with his arms stretched ahead as the green aura trails behind him, shouting that he will lure Mad Skull there. Jean smiles slightly while watching Jonathan move faster and realizes magic is pretty cool. Claire looks forward calmly as white feathers drift around her while Jean wonders if he could use magic too if he learned. A mercenary grips a spear and shouts that there is no time to dawdle because Mad Skull will be there soon. A voice warns that if even one person makes a mistake they could all die as Jonathan runs along the edge of the cavern while nets stretch across the pit and someone shouts for everyone to stay sharp. Jean grips a spear and looks ahead while thinking that driving the monster into a trap and pouring firepower into it is not a bad plan. Jean stares forward with a serious expression while wondering if this strategy will work against Mad Skull. Jonathan sprints forward with green energy swirling around his legs as a horned creature charges after him from behind. Jonathan turns his head and shouts for the trap team. A massive horned monster lunges forward with its mouth open as Jonathan leaps away. 2 mercenaries pull on the ropes and shout that it appeared and that it is Mad Skull. The giant monster roars as the net drops over it and tightens around its body. Several mercenaries lean back and pull hard on the ropes as someone shouts to pull. The massive horned monster crashes to the ground while tangled tightly inside the net. Jonathan runs toward the trapped monster and shouts for the spears. Several mercenaries rush forward while gripping their spears. One mercenary drives his spear downward into Mad Skull through the net. Mad Skull's jaws open wide as it snarls through the net. Several mercenaries yank on the ropes to tighten the net around Mad Skull's body. Mad Skull roars loudly while trapped inside the tightening net as the mercenaries continue pulling the ropes. Jean realizes the situation is turning bad and says it's not good. Ahead of him a huge horned monster thrashes inside a net as mercenaries struggle to hold the ropes. Several men are dragged across the ground as they struggle to keep the net tight, and one of them shouts in frustration that there are so many of them yet they cannot even restrain a single monster. Mad Skull suddenly surges upward, tearing the net apart as pieces snap and fly through the air. Mad Skull's red eye glows fiercely as it tears through the net. A violent shockwave spreads across the ground, knocking several mercenaries off their feet and sending them tumbling away. Freed from the trap, the massive beast charges forward with explosive speed toward Claire on the ground. Seeing Mad Skull rushing at her, she raises her glowing hand in panic and realizes the danger as she stammers in shock. Claire runs forward with her glowing hand raised as Jean stands in front of her. Mad Skull's head slams into Jean as he spreads his arms and blocks it directly in front of Claire. His boots grind against the ground. He grabs Mad Skull's tusk with both hands and strains as he forces its head back. Mad Skull presses its head forward with glowing red eyes inches from his face. Claire reaches toward him and shouts that Jean, it's dangerous. Jean looks forward with a tense expression and says don't worry. Mad Skull faces forward with glowing red eyes and bared teeth as he says he knows how to take down a Mad Skull. Jean stares ahead with glowing red eyes and a sharp grin. He grips both tusks and braces himself over Mad Skull's head. Jean releases his hand and shifts his body to the side. His hand reaches for the sword behind his back as Mad Skull's face looms over him. Jean grips his sword tightly with both hands close to his face. Mad Skull's head jerks back as the sword strikes it with force. He braces his body and grips his sword tightly as he admits he thought he had gotten stronger. Mad Skull roars forward with its mouth wide open, showing its fangs and tusks as it is described to have incredible raw power. Jean turns sharply with widened eyes as he realizes he let his guard down. His eyes narrow as green energy with floating feathers swirls around his face and he reacts in confusion. He spins in midair surrounded by swirling green energy while Mad Skull charges toward him and Claire reaches forward and says she will help too. Jean looks at the swirling energy around his body and says his body feels much lighter, like he dropped heavy weight. He smirks slightly as the green energy continues to flow around him and says he should be able to hunt it more easily with this. Several men run forward holding weapons as they shout they will help, and he turns back toward them and shouts, "No, stay back." Jonathan stares forward with a tense expression as his jaw tightens. Green energy and white feathers swirl around Jin's body as he moves and says, "For now." He dashes past Mad Skull with green energy trailing around him as he says it is easier alone. He runs forward across the ground with his sword in hand as he explains that to hunt a Mad Skull only a few things are needed. Mad Skull faces forward with glowing red eyes as he says it runs fast in a straight line. Mad Skull charges straight toward him in a direct path as he says turning is difficult for it and he will use that to stop it. Jean leaps upward with green energy spiraling around him above the charging monster. Mad Skull crashes through debris and stone as he moves away beneath it. A clawed foot strikes the ground, cracking the surface beneath it. The Mad Skull's body scrapes across the ground as debris and stone scatter around its face. He hangs in the air looking downward as green energy and feathers swirl around him and says this is the power of the buff and it is struggling more to chase him. He raises one hand near the creature's face as he explains its tusks are as long swords and function like hands. He lifts his sword overhead and says the tusks are too hard to cut with a sword. He drives his blade straight down the creature's face and says he will aim for its weak point, the nose. Blood bursts from the creature's face as it screams loudly. Mad Skull roars and thrashes as blood sprays while the pain intensifies with every movement, leaving it staggered and too burdened to continue attacking. He flips downward midair with his sword gripped in both hands as green energy and feathers spiral around him while he descends. Blood bursts from the creature's body as his blade cuts through its nose. More blood sprays from the creature's nose as its body jerks from the impact. He swings his sword beneath the towering creature as blood splashes upward, leaving Mad Skull no chance to attack again. He faces forward with a slight grin with blood splattered across his face and cloak. A group of people run out of a large stone gate holding weapons as dust lingers in the air. They stand looking over scattered rubble and broken structures as one asks what happened and another says to find Jean first. Claire and Jonathan stare ahead with wide eyes as Mutt slides past in front of them. Mutt stands with its body lowered and teeth bared as it growls. Claire stares ahead wide-eyed while Jonathan grips her shoulder and looks forward in shock. Mutt throws its head back with its jaws wide open and roars loudly as Claire stands behind and asks if it is telling them not to interfere. Mutt stands on the ground facing forward while the group gathers behind it and Jean stands ahead of them. Jean looks down with a calm expression as someone calls out that he made it back alive and asks what happened to the Mad Skull. Jean faces the group and says there is no Mad Skull now, and Jonathan responds in confusion. Mutt stands on the corpse of the fallen Mad Skull as Jean says all that is left is pork. The group surrounds the body and looks toward Jean as they say it is amazing and ask if he really did it alone, adding they have never heard of anyone taking down a Mad Skull solo. Mutt tilts its head upward with its mouth slightly open and lets out a soft whine. Mutt bares its teeth and growls while Jonathan turns his head toward it with a startled expression. A second Mad Skull steps out from the dark tunnel with glowing red eyes with its body low and facing forward. The Mad Skull blares forward with its eyes glowing red and its tusks bared. Jonathan grips his spear and shouts that it is a Mad Skull and orders everyone to prepare for battle. Claire steps forward with her hand raised toward him and tells him to wait. Mad Skull lowers its head beside two small piglets standing near its legs as it is revealed that it has piglets. Two piglets stand side by side looking forward and squeal. Mad Skull lowers its head and growls with one eye narrowed as it snorts. Jean stands facing forward while Mutt beside him bares its teeth and growls. Mad Skull stands near the tunnel entrance with its head lowered beside the piglets as they stay close to it. The group stands facing the Mad Skull and its piglets while the creature remains in front of them and someone says they are leaving. Jonathan stands with his spear lowered while Claire looks uneasy and he says the creature must have been planning to raise its young here and adds that she feels bad. Jean looks ahead calmly and says he is glad it left peacefully. A quiet city street lies under the night sky with the full moon overhead, identified as 5th Pioneer City. A closed building with a wooden door and a hanging sign sits along the street with warm light glowing from the windows. Jonathan stands with his arms spread wide at the table as the group around him cheers and he praises everyone for finishing without serious injuries and says he is happy they caught the Mad Skull. He leans forward with a confident grin and gestures with his hand as he announces the highlight of the hunt and says it is time for settlement. Several men around the table raise their fists and shout in excitement as food and drinks sit spread out in front of them. Claire sits at the table holding a sack while Jean behind her crosses his arms and she says the reward was supposed to be 70 gold coins, but this looks like more. A bag filled with gold coins sits open on the table as he says it is thanks to him making a fuss over it. An image of two mad skulls and piglets appears as he explains there were two of them and the job was more dangerous than expected, so he demanded a bigger reward. Jonathan spreads his arms wide behind several sacks of gold as he declares the reward is 110 gold coins while the others cheer. Jean stands with his arms crossed facing him and questions why they still received the money despite not fighting the mother, and Jonathan responds hesitantly. Jonathan smirks with his hand over his mouth and says he told a little white lie. Two men grin and give thumbs up as they laugh and one says that is their captain and if you do not get caught it becomes the truth. Jean stands with his arms crossed and exhales as he calls them interesting people. A hand grabs Jin's shoulder from behind as he turns his head slightly and Jonathan calls out. Jonathan holds Jean by the shoulder and says he is thinking of giving half of the earnings to Jean and asks if anyone has a problem. Jean looks to the side with a surprised expression and repeats half of it. Jonathan smiles calmly and says they would have died without him and asks him to accept it happily. He keeps his hand on Jin's shoulder while facing the group and says the increased reward is enough for everyone to split and that it is what they all want. Two men sit at the table smiling and one gives a thumbs up while laughing while another raises the mug beside him. Jean touches his cheek with one finger and looks forward as he acknowledges the buff and the trap were a big help. A hand grips a foamy mug on the table as he says it seems not everyone here is bad. Jean raises a mug high while Jonathan pumps his fist and he shouts that he will pay for all the drinks tonight as the group cheers. Several men tilt barrels over their heads and drink heavily while others raise fists and shout to keep drinking and get wasted. Jean sits holding a mug as he turns his head toward Claire passing by. Claire walks toward the door with a bag at her side and says she's going to practice some magic as Jean calls out to her. Jean looks forward with a slightly surprised expression and repeats practice some magic. A full moon hangs over the night sky as Claire sits on the ground facing the town with her body surrounded by a faint blue aura. Claire sits cross-legged with her eyes closed and hands resting on her knees as blue energy flows upward around her. Jean stands with his arms crossed near a tree watching her and notes she must be tired and that training right after a hunt is impressive. Jean looks toward her with a focused expression and says magic. Jean considers learning magic as Claire remains seated in front of him glowing with blue energy. Claire turns toward Jean in a storage area while holding a crate as he carries a large rolled net over his shoulder and asks if she can teach him magic. She faces him calmly with the crate in her hands while Jean stands beside her thinking she agreed pretty easily while she says she wanted to give him something as a gift anyway. Claire leans back against the crates with her arms relaxed and says he saved her when the mad skull charged at them and that teaching him magic is the least she can do. Claire stands facing Jean with one hand on her hip as she says she would refuse to teach a mercenary group that does not protect their mages while Jonathan looks aside with a troubled expression. Jonathan leans in with a grin and raises a finger beside Claire as he says magic cannot be learned overnight and that they are leaving in 2 days. Claire faces him with a serious expression as he laughs and suggests Jean should come with them and she questions why a strong hunter like him would follow mercenaries like them. Jonathan places his hand on Jin's shoulder and smiles with his eyes closed as he says a brave wolf is usually most comfortable alone and that it would be rude for them to intrude on his journey. Jean looks forward with a flat expression and says he has nothing to do and feels pressured by the situation. Jean stands beside Jonathan and Claire as he asks about their next destination and Jonathan raises both hands while Claire grabs his vest and says it is the 4th pioneer city where there is a big job. Jean turns his head slightly and says he was already planning to go there and asks if he can accompany them. Jean lifts a large rolled net and awkwardly says he could learn magic along the way while Jonathan and Claire grin with flushed faces and give a thumbs up as they remark he is terrible at lying and that they hooked him. Jonathan wraps an arm around Jean and grins widely while Claire leans against him with her eyes closed and he says it is a coincidence and that it is great to have a reliable ally. Jean looks forward with a small smirk as the next destination has been decided. A large armored beast walks along the path carrying a structure on its back while several people travel nearby. A massive creature lifts its head and roars as it is identified as a Teresk, a monster bred for transport and tamed by humanity. Jean stands beside the enormous creature with a bag on his back and looks up at it as he notes it is used as a pack animal and that it is massive. Jonathan walks ahead with a bag over his shoulder and gestures forward as he says to get moving because they have a long way to go. Jean sits cross-legged under the moon with Claire beside him both with eyes closed as he focuses on training and says learning something new is difficult. Sweat runs down Jin's face as he keeps his eyes closed and says learning is hard with the most difficult part being repetitive effort. Claire stands facing Jean with a glowing blue orb in her hand as he says growth in certain tasks is only possible through repetition. Jean looks to the side with sweat running down his face as he says this is hard and continues repeating the same action. Jean sits under the night sky while Claire gestures beside him and he says he is used to this pain. He endured 12 years of pain in the demonic realm and has become tougher because of it. Jean sits cross-legged under the moon as leaves fall around him in silence. Jean opens his eyes slightly as a faint blue stream of energy flows near his face and he focuses on it. A small blue spark forms and drifts upward as he recognizes the sensation. Claire clasps her hands and leans forward with excitement as she says he succeeded in feeling the magic and Jean turns his head and asks if that was mana. Jean looks forward with a slight smile and says it took 10 days just to feel mana and that it is difficult. Claire kneels beside him with her hands resting on her knees and smiles as she says he is slow but still excellent and that some people never feel mana at all. Claire reaches into her pouch and pulls out a small bottle as she says they will move on to the second stage. She tilts the bottle and pours glowing blue liquid into a shallow dish as it ripples with light. Claire raises one hand calmly and looks at Jean as she tells him to undress. Jean turns his head toward her with a startled expression as she clenches her gloved fist in front of him, leaves drift under the bright moon in the night sky. A glowing blue droplet falls from her fingertip into the liquid below as she says excuse me. Jean turns his head in confusion and asks what she is doing. Claire presses her gloved hand against his back and a glowing magic circle spreads across his skin forming intricate symbols and lines. She calmly explains that she can inject mana into his body with it and that she is creating a path. The formation completes covering his entire back as she says it is done and tells him she will begin injecting mana asking him to focus and feel it carefully. Jean closes his eyes and responds quietly. In the next moment the circle flares to life. A surge of blue energy pours into his body and his entire figure lights up as streams of mana cascade through him. The power intensifies spiraling upward under the moonlight as his muscles tense. Jean clenches slightly as the sensation overwhelms him and realizes the feeling is on a completely different level than before. Deep inside glowing currents begin to spread branching through his body like veins of light. He senses something thicker than blood moving within him. Claire watches from behind and asks if he can feel the mana. Jean steadies himself and answers that he can feel something flowing inside his body. Claire closes her eyes and speaks calmly telling him he has taken the first step to using magic and that there are 3 basic stages. A glowing figure presses a hand over a magic circle as bright energy erupts downward and she explains the stages are feeling mana, storing it, and then utilizing it. Claire places a hand on her chest and looks forward saying since he succeeded in the first stage they will move to the second. Jean sits upright with his eyes closed and one hand raised as blue energy surrounds him while she says she will control the mana and send it toward his heart and tells him to hold his breath sensation to create a vessel. Jean tightens his expression with sweat running down his face as he says he is preparing to store the mana in his body. Claire sits behind him with her hand on his back as a surge of blue light bursts outward and she says she will start. A glowing magic circle spreads across Jin's back as streams of blue energy rise around him. A distorted insect-like creature attacks another monster from behind as its glowing eyes appear against a dark splattered background. A large insect-like creature with glowing eyes bites into another monster as its wings spread against a dark splattered background. The creature's body twists forward showing its segmented torso and long limbs. Its back arches as its wings and abdomen stretch outward in a distorted pose. A cluster of red glowing eyes fills its head all staring forward. Claire's eyes widen as sweat forms on her face and she looks forward in alarm while questioning the ominous energy. She turns her head sharply to the side as blue energy streams past her. She thrusts both hands forward toward Jin's back as a swirling blue vortex forms at his lower back. Her eye trembles with tears and sweat as she realizes her mana is being absorbed and fears it will all be drained. A sharp tail wraps around Claire from behind as her body jerks backward from the impact. Mud lifts Claire into the air with its tail as blue energy trails around her body while Jean sits cross-legged nearby within a swirling blue aura. The red wolf lowers Claire to the ground as she lands on her feet and stares in shock asking if it is the red wolf. The red wolf lowers its head and glares at her with glowing eyes. Sweat runs down Claire's face as she looks ahead and wonders if it came to help her. Jean steps toward her with his arm raised and calls out to her. He reaches toward her with concern and asks if she is okay. Claire looks to the side with a tense expression as sweat drips down her face and realizes what she saw was his mental world. A dark insect-like creature with glowing red eyes stands over twisted ground as a person's power and nature take shape and appear as a world. A mass covered in many glowing red eyes fills the darkness as a person's mental world differs depending on the life they have lived. Jean stands shirtless in the dark mental world while enormous eyes and a looming creature surround him as such an ominous presence exists inside his mind. Claire leans toward Jean as he sits on the ground and she asks him to answer her honestly. Claire stands with her arms crossed and asks Jean if he has eaten an internal core. Jean looks up at her and asks what an internal core is. A glowing crystal core floats in the air as she explains it is the crystal found inside a monster's body, and Jean answers that he has eaten monster essence. Claire grabs Jean by the shoulders and shouts in shock that he ate internal cores and demands to know when and how many he ate. Claire stares forward with wide eyes and sweat on her face as Jean says he started eating internal cores while hunting monsters and has continued eating them for about 10 years, possibly thousands or tens of thousands. Jean scratches the back of his head and asks why she is asking and whether there is a problem, and Claire shouts that there is definitely a problem. Claire lowers her voice and says that if a human eats an internal core, Claire looks down with a tense expression and says they either die or turn into a monster. Jean tilts his head upward under the moonlight as one of his eyes glows red. A deer stands over a bloody carcass in a dark forest as she says karma is also known as retribution. A deer with glowing eyes and blood around its mouth stands in the forest as karma is the turbid energy found in the demonic realm, and beings that absorb it gain bizarre abilities in their bodies. A monstrous deer roars as a monster core is a nucleus formed from accumulated karma inside the body. Claire stands beside the Teresk while Jean and Jonathan walk near it on the forest path. Claire narrows her eye and says it is bothering her while saying the dark priest appears when the otherworldly gate opens and karma swallows the world. A robed figure raises his arm as a massive ice spreads behind him, and some humans follow the monsters that absorb karma and begin calling them angels. A monstrous deer stands over a human body on a stone altar as those people eat monster cores, and some sacrifice humans to monsters and they are called madmen. Jean looks forward and says he started eating them while hunting monsters and has continued eating them for about 10 years, possibly thousands or tens of thousands. A mass of glowing red eyes fills the darkness as Claire realizes Jean has eaten monster cores and wonders if he could be a dark priest. Claire lowers her head in thought while Jean stands behind her with a question mark over his head as she concludes he cannot be a dark priest because he would not admit to eating monster cores or show her his mental world. Jean swings his sword and slices through a purple creature as Claire walks away behind him and wonders if it is even stranger that he kept eating monster cores without knowing they were dangerous. Jean holds the severed creature in one hand as blood drips from the cut. Claire closes her eyes while Jean stands behind her chewing, and she wonders why he would pick up and eat something so disgusting. Claire folds her arms and looks ahead while Jean chews beside her as she thinks he is truly a mysterious man and wonders what he eats now, and Jean copied monsters eating monster cores. She leans toward Jean with a serious expression and tells him he must stop eating monster cores from now on because he has only been lucky so far and could really die. Jean rests his hand against his chin and thinks that she says eating monster cores kills a person or turns them into a monster, yet he stands alive in front of her and wonders if that information is wrong. Jean looks forward with a calm expression as he wonders if feeling nothing after killing people and constantly wanting to fight is because of the monster cores. Jin's eye glows red as he stares ahead and wonders if the monster cores are the reason. Jean walks away with a sack over his shoulder and says he will try, and Claire shouts after him that he must absolutely stop eating monster cores. Claire stands behind him with her arms crossed and warns that if he keeps eating monster cores his life will be at risk and he will not be able to use magic, and Jean suddenly reacts in surprise. Jean looks back at her and asks if it is true that he will not be able to use magic, and Claire replies that it is more important than his life. Claire exhales and says that in his current state it will be difficult for him to use mana manifestation, but tells him not to worry too much. Claire raises one finger and says he should still be able to use mana arts at least. Jean turns his head and asks what mana arts are. Fourth Pioneer City stands with a tall tower rising above the surrounding buildings. People gather in a plaza beneath a tall column topped with a winged statue as water flows from the fountain around it. Jean looks around the crowded plaza as Claire and Jonathan stand behind him, and he says many mercenaries have gathered here and it is too early to be surprised because of the scale of the request. A silver-haired knight in armor walks before the crowd as the request is being overseen by a holy knight. Holy Knight Raymond walks forward in full armor with a long sword at his side. Jean glances back while Claire smiles beside him as the Holy Knight watches them from behind. The Holy Knight looks toward Jean and senses an intense aura that cannot be compared to mercenaries and recognizes he is no ordinary human. Jean looks toward Claire and asks if many people usually gather when a Holy Knight is in charge. Claire explains that it is because the request comes from the Golden Bug Wolf. Jean looks at Claire and asks if the golden bug is an insect-type monster, and she asks if he really does not know about the golden bug. Jean stares back with a confused expression as she says he really knows nothing except hunting. Jean walks beside Jonathan and Claire as he lifts his arms behind his head and says the Golden Bug is the greatest businessman and a tycoon with countless assets, making him one of the richest people anywhere. Jonathan lowers his gaze and says the Golden Bug died suddenly recently. Jean walks beside him and asks if the Golden Bug was killed. Jonathan walks with his arms behind his head and says there are rumors about that but nothing is certain. Jean looks toward the crowd gathered around the request board and asks why so many people have gathered if the Golden Bug is dead. Jonathan walks beside Jean and explains the Golden Bug has 2 sons. The 2 sons stand back to back while gold treasure chests and valuables shine beneath them as someone must move the son's fortune inside the barrier. Jean looks ahead in silence and thinks about moving a tycoon's fortune as he notices the large crowd gathered. Jean stiffens slightly while standing with Claire and Jonathan as a voice calls for the Black Marlin mercenary group to come forward. Jonathan pushes Jean forward through the crowd shouting that it is finally their turn and telling him to come with him. He stands beside Jean and gestures toward him while presenting him as the mercenary group's top power who caught a mad skull and tamed a werewolf. Jean turns his head slightly as sweat runs down his face while people in the crowd look toward him and say he is the rumored head crusher and that he does not look that strong. Jonathan smiles beside Jean while Jean looks uneasy and the man says to ignore the nonsense and that things will go well if they put up with it. The silver-haired holy knight Raymond looks forward with a calm expression. Jean and Jonathan stand in front of the request board while Raymond announces that the Black Marlin mercenary group will receive a reward of 100 gold coins and must depart tomorrow at sunrise. Jonathan clenches his fist and shouts for them to go while Jean raises his fist beside him and says they are paying 100 gold coins just to move luggage. He smiles confidently and gives a thumbs up while explaining that half of the payment is for the labor and half is for the name value, which is how the hiring fee is set. Jean looks forward with a calm expression as sweat runs down his face while Jonathan says they got a great rate thanks to Jin's name value as the head crusher. Jonathan stands beside Jean and explains that head crusher is the nickname attached to him while an image of Jean crushing the head of a monster appears above them. Jean exhales with a tired expression and says whoever came up with that nickname has terrible naming sense. Jonathan walks beside Jean with a sack over his shoulder and says that 100 gold coins is like hitting the jackpot while Jean walks beside him silently. Jean looks forward with a serious expression and says that this level of fame will help him learn mana arts. A large building stands under the moonlight as lamps glow from the windows and the place is identified as the mercenary group quarters. Inside a crowded arena, a fighter battles another man while people around the ring shout for him to kill and tell the opponent not to run away. A fighter's fist slams into another fighter's face, snapping his head back from the impact. Claire stands near the arena railing and asks if Jean will be okay participating in the arena while a fighter in the ring raises his arms in victory and Jean wraps bandages around his hands. Jean tightens the bandage around his fist and says he plans to draw their attention and learn mana arts while Claire watches him with a worried expression. Jean stands inside the wooden arena adjusting the bandages on his arm as the chronicle explains that holy knights are beings who become interested when they see someone strong. Raymond looks forward with a calm expression as the chronicle explains that if they acknowledge someone's strength, that person can receive good treatment. Jean stands in the arena facing an opponent with his fists wrapped and says this will not be too hard for him. Jean looks toward the arena stands and says this arena is where fighters risk each other's reputations and that he will draw the holy knight's attention here. Jean strikes his opponent's face with a fast punch and calls it the first one. An opponent's arm swings across and hits Jin's face from the side. Jin's fist slams into the opponent's face and blood bursts outward as the man's head jerks back from the impact. Jean grabs the opponent's head with both hands as the opponent's body recoils. Jean drives his head into the opponent's face. The opponent's body whips backward through the air as Jean stands with one leg raised and the crowd cheers that the head crusher is living up to his name. Raymond lifts a mug and drinks while looking toward the arena as Jean realizes he has drawn attention. Jean swings another punch into a different opponent's face and thinks that just drawing attention is not enough and that the real start is now. Jean spins and kicks an opponent across the head as he thinks he must defeat more fighters to make the holy knight take him seriously. Jean drives his knee down into another opponent's head while thinking that defeating 2 or 3 fighters like this should be enough. Raymond stands at the balcony railing watching the arena while Jean thinks that the holy knight will wonder where someone like him came from. Jean stands in the arena with defeated fighters lying on the ground around him and thinks about defeating many opponents. Jean looks toward the balcony where Raymond and the red-haired knight stand while thinking that a real knight would think like this. Raymond turns his head toward the red-haired knight and tells Rex to fight that guy. Rex looks forward with a tense expression and reacts in disbelief at being told to fight a mere mercenary. Jean stands below the balcony while Raymond and Rex look down at him as it becomes clear that when that moment arrives, that is when things truly begin. Jean looks forward with a calm expression and says he refuses, declaring that this is how negotiations to learn mana arts begin. Rex stares forward with widened eyes and reacts in shock. The mercenary dormitory stands under the night sky as the full moon shines above the building. Claire looks ahead with a worried expression and remains silent. Jonathan looks forward silently with a tense face. Several people in the arena crowd stare toward the ring with confused expressions, and one of them asks what is going on. Rex grips the railing and shouts down at Jean, demanding to know why he refuses. Rex clenches his fist and grits his teeth in anger while Raymond looks forward calmly beside him. Raymond stands at the railing and looks down at Jean while asking if he is hurt anywhere. Jean raises one bandaged hand with a relaxed smile and says he is not hurt at all. Raymond narrows his eyes and asks why Jean is refusing the duel. Jean stands in the arena with one hand on his chest and tells the Holy Knight that he is a mercenary who chases money and power and cannot fight a Holy Knight apprentice for free. Jean looks up with a confident smile and says they should make a bet. Raymond looks down thoughtfully and says that for a bet to work, both sides must have something they want, and asks what they could possibly want from him. Jean crouches beside a fallen fighter while looking up at them and says that even if he is not a grand enough figure to boost their reputation, he does have an ungodly amount of money. He lifts a heavy money pouch filled with gold coins as it swings in his hand. Jean stands in the arena holding the pouch while the crowd reacts in shock and someone shouts that he is suggesting gambling with a Holy Knight. Rex glares forward with clenched teeth and angrily calls Jean a bastard. Raymond reaches out and grabs Rex's shoulder as Raymond shouts that they do not need Jean's money. He looks forward calmly and says instead. Jean looks up at two figures in robes standing behind a wooden railing as Raymond says they will waive all liability for any damages sustained during the fight. Raymond looks down from the balcony and says that is what they want. Jean smiles and taps his chest with his finger, saying he will tell them what he wants after the duel is over, as he thinks that without paying any settlement he can beat Rex as much as he wants, and says he accepts. Rex tightens the bandages around his hand while standing across from Jean in the arena. Rex stares forward with a tense glare as sweat marks and shadows cover his face. Jean looks straight ahead with narrowed eyes and a calm expression. Spectators lean over the railing and shout encouragement while pointing toward the arena, saying to go for it and betting their fortune on Jean. Jean turns his body slightly while Claire stands behind him with her hands clenched, and Jonathan crosses his arms and tells Jean to give a signal if it becomes dangerous, and Jean answers not to worry. Jean tilts his head with a confident smile and says he will win. Rex stands in the arena looking forward while asking how far he should go, and Raymond answers from the balcony to give it his all. Raymond looks down toward the arena with narrowed eyes and says Jean will certainly not be an easy opponent. Rex stands with his back to the viewer as golden energy swirls around his body, and he clenches both fists while saying he understands. Several spectators lean over the railing and shout excitedly as they notice mana arts and cheer for the Holy Knight. Rex plants his foot on the ground as golden energy spirals around his leg. Rex rushes forward with golden energy trailing around him as he closes the distance toward Jean. Jean turns his head with wide eyes and thinks Rex's speed is on a completely different level. Rex's fist crashes into Jin's body with a burst of golden force. Jin's face tightens with blood at the corner of his mouth as he realizes that taking a clean hit from an attack like this could kill him. Rex's arm drives forward through the air with golden energy streaming around it as Jean watches closely and calls the mana arts interesting. Jean raises his bandaged hand in front of his face and blocks the incoming strike. Rex drives his glowing fist straight down toward Jean with golden energy bursting around the impact point. The blow explodes against Jean and throws him backward across the arena floor. Jean wipes the blood from his mouth with the back of his bandaged hand, and Rex asks if his name was Jean. Rex glares forward with golden energy flickering around his fist and says Jean may be a renowned mercenary in the demonic realm, but he is still just a wild beast, and he will make him regret looking down on a Holy Knight. Spectators lean over the railing in shock as they say the Crusher is being pushed back and that even an apprentice Holy Knight is on another level, while one man shouts that he might lose all his money. Claire watches the fight with a tense expression and murmurs Jin's name. Raymond stands with his arms crossed and watches the arena silently. Rex rushes forward surrounded by spiraling golden energy as Jean raises his arms and braces while sliding backward. Jean shields his face with his bandaged hand as the golden force crashes toward him. The impact blasts Jean backward across the arena floor. Raymond touches his chin and wonders what this strange feeling is. Jean crosses his arms in front of his body and blocks as golden strikes crash against him, while the observer notes that when he fought the other mercenaries he defeated them all with a single strike. Raymond narrows his eye and observes that Jin's movements right now are extremely passive and wonders if he is hiding something. Rex shouts angrily with his teeth clenched. Rex leaps high into the air with golden energy spiraling around his arm and drives a glowing fist downward. The glowing strike slams toward Jean as he deflects it across the arena. Jean leans aside and extends his hand as Rex's glowing strike crashes into the balcony beside him and shatters the floor. Jonathan clenches his fist and shouts that Jean deflected the Holy Knight's mana arts with his bare hand while asking if that is even possible. He stares forward with wide eyes and a tense expression. Jean turns his back slightly with blood dripping from his mouth and says with this. He wipes the blood from his mouth with a faint smile and says he is done measuring Rex's combat power. Jean lowers his bandaged fist and asks if he should check Rex's durability next. His strike slams into Rex's body with a violent impact that bursts outward. Rex's eyes widen in shock as sweat runs down his face. Raymond frowns in confusion and thinks that Rex was only hit by a normal punch, yet he is making that kind of expression and wonders if that man was not waiting for an opening all this time. Rex bends forward and coughs violently while Jean stands calmly beside him, and the knight realizes Jean was simply savoring the fight. Jean looks down with a faint smile, blood still on the corner of his mouth. Jean bends down and says he hit Rex pretty hard, yet he is still enduring it and wonders if that is thanks to Rex's mana arts as well. Rex, sweating and breathing heavily, says he is curious. Jean cracks his fingers and says he wants to see just how many hits Rex can endure. Rex's expression tightens in confusion as he senses someone step forward. Raymond raises his hand toward Rex and calmly says stop, adding that it is Rex's loss. He faces forward with a stern expression and says they will grant what was promised, telling him to end it here. Jean stands with a relaxed posture, his bandaged hand hanging at his side, and says he was just getting started and calls it a buzzkill. He forms a faint smile with blood smeared on his lips as he remains still. He concludes that his plan was a success. The crowd leans forward with raised fists around the arena as they shout in excitement. Jean stands facing the two knights on the platform. A large mansion stands under the night sky with a fountain in front. This place is Golden Bug Wolf's mansion. A man bites into a large piece of meat as grease drips from his mouth. Two shirtless men sit at a table covered in food and tear into meat with their hands. They are Golden Bug's first son Derek and second son Cedric. Both men chew on large pieces of meat as sweat runs down their faces. One of them says it will take 10 days to get inside the wall and curses the Order Alliance for it. He chews with his teeth clenched as sweat runs down his face and says that is how those bastards operate, calling them all talk and no substance. A hand tightly grips a bundle of noodles and squeezes it as sauce splatters outward. He asks if they will be okay until then and says there is nothing else they can do. One man leans over the table while holding food near his mouth, his back covered in glowing blue growths. He says they just have to pray their bodies hold out until then. The blue growths bulge and pulse across his skin. Raymond stands beside a tree with his hand resting on the trunk and his sword at his side, and he says mana arts exist. He stands with his back turned beside the tree as his cloak hangs down, and he says mana is used like part of the body to enhance one's body or weapons. His hand grips the sword hilt as golden energy wraps around it, and he says anyone with some talent can use it, but its power depends on proficiency. A sweeping golden arc tears through the air as Raymond swings his sword, and he says the technique is a basic form capable of splitting mountains and seas called Sacred Fire Slash. A violent shockwave blasts through the area as trees bend and debris scatters and birds scatter into the sky as the impact erupts. Raymond stands calmly with his sword lowered as golden energy surrounds him. Rex clasped his hands together with a wide smile and praises Raymond, calling him amazing. He leans forward and points excitedly while speaking, and Raymond turns slightly and tells him to back off. Rex throws one arm up energetically with a big grin and shouts that he understands, telling him to keep up the good work. Jean stands with a neutral expression as an image of a beast appears behind him, and he says he feels like he has seen that somewhere before. He looks ahead with a calm, unreadable expression as his eyes narrow slightly while he wonders if that was even a proper mana art and thinks it definitely feels stronger than what that apprentice knight used. Jean stands with his hand on his chin in thought, and he questions if that level should be possible even without a technique. Raymond turns his head toward Jean while standing beside him, and he says he has already shown him firsthand and tells him to focus again as Jean answers yes. Jean grips his sword with both hands while standing straight, and Raymond stands close behind him and explains that when he flexes his arm the veins pop and the muscles contract. Raymond closes his eyes slightly as he speaks, and he says you're holding the mana within your muscles. Jean narrows his eyes with a focused expression and says up to this point it is similar to what Claire taught him. A faint blue flow moves across his face as he looks forward and reacts with a quiet sound. He looks down at his hand as blue energy flows around his arm, and he notices there is a large amount of mana flowing through his body and questions when he had this much mana. In a memory, Claire places her hand on Jin's back as blue energy flows between them and he says mana is calm and light and he recognizes it as Claire's mana. Dark purple energy coils tightly around Jin's torso and arm as he stands still. Raymond turns his head slightly while speaking and tells Jin to gradually consume that mana and says moving your body at first can help. The purple energy thickens and coils beside Jin's body and Raymond turns sharply with a startled expression. Jin grips his sword tightly with both hands as purple energy wraps around the blade and sweat runs down his face as he looks forward. Raymond stares with widened eyes and reacts in shock that Jin is using mana arts immediately after learning it and focuses on the ominous mana. The blade is engulfed in dense purple energy that twists around it and he questions what that ominous mana is. Raymond looks down toward Jin while speaking and says mana arts take their color and form based on one's mental world and adds but to have such mana that feels so ominous while Jin holds his sword as the purple energy surrounds it. Raymond narrows his eyes and calls Jin's name as he demands to know what is inside him. He raises his sword in front of his face while purple energy coils around his body and blade as he smirks. He swings the sword as a wide arc of purple energy extends outward and his body is lifted sideways by the force. He grips the sword with both hands and drives it downward as purple energy surges along the blade. Jin lowers his gaze with a serious expression as purple energy surrounds him and he questions if his proficiency is low and says it feels inefficient compared to the effort required. He stands upright holding the sword as dark purple energy surrounds the blade and he smirks and says this is fucking cool and that he cannot wait to try it out in real combat. Two massive turtle-like beasts carry structures and supplies on their backs while several people walk alongside them across a grassy path. Jin stands beside the smiling Claire while carrying a bag on his back and clutching its strap and she says he has already mastered mana arts and that it could not have been easy and that it is amazing and he says that it is all thanks to her. He turns his head toward Claire with a concerned expression and asks if she is okay and says that when she helped him last time it felt like her mana went inside him. Claire widens her eyes slightly with a small sweat drop on her cheek. She smiles and lightly raises her hand toward her face while facing him and says she is fine and that he saved her before so he should consider it a gift. Jin looks forward with a calm expression as he reflects that there was too much mana to ignore and that thanks to it he learned mana arts quickly. Rex on horseback looks ahead while speaking as Jin turns his head back with a small surprised reaction and hears that it is unbelievable to rejoice over just the basics and Jin responds with a questioning sound. Rex looks down with a stern expression and speaks as he tells him not to slack off and to be grateful to Lord Raymond. Jin and Claire stand side by side looking toward Rex with unimpressed expressions as he questions why he is spouting nonsense and wonders if he is still upset about losing yesterday. He smirks with narrowed eyes as he says he was getting bored anyway and that he should bruise his ego and pick a fight. A gloved hand strikes the horse's side with a sharp impact. The horse jerks its head up with its eyes bulging and teeth clenched as it neighs loudly while Rex yanks the reins in shock. Raymond sits upright on his horse while looking forward as Rex speeds away down the path and he says Jin should understand and that he will keep him in check while Jin thinks what a shame. Raymond rides past Jin while a voice shouts you idiots as Jin stands beside him and reacts with confusion. Food and dishes scatter through the air as containers break apart and a voice off-screen shouts that they are hungry and demands it be brought faster. Jin rests a bag over his shoulder and looks toward the distance with a neutral expression as he says it looks like something is going on over there while Raymond in front tells him not to worry about it. Two workers stand beside a wooden platform loaded with barrels and sacks as one handles the goods and explains that it is just the usual power trip from the employers while another voice asks if they mean the Golden Bug Sons. Two shirtless men sit at a table in a dim room while eating messily with food scattered around as one holds a glass and the other stuffs his mouth and it is explained that since Golden Bug Wolf's death they have been binge eating and throw tantrums if their meals are delayed. Raymond narrows his eyes slightly as he speaks calmly and says it will only give a headache to care so ignoring them is the answer. Jin tilts his head slightly with a doubtful expression as he questions whether it is strange for it to just be stress-induced binge eating while thinking he has a bad feeling about this. A man shoves food into his mouth with sweat on his face as he chews messily while it is stated that the more food disappears the stronger it feels. A grotesque man drools heavily with bulging eyes and veins popping as he gags and retches violently. Jin stares forward with a serious expression as it is stated that it feels like a monster is about to burst out. Jin's eye widens sharply as he reacts in sudden alarm. Teresk bursts upward from the ground as debris flies into the air and Jin looks up while shouting what is going on all of a sudden. Teresk slams its head down with its mouth open and tongue hanging out as it roars loudly. Workers recoil and point toward the enormous creature towering over them as they shout in panic that the Teresk carrying their clients has suddenly started rampaging. Raymond's eyes widen in shock as he realizes the situation involves the Golden Bug Sons. Raymond shouts Rex. While Rex pulls the reins hard and Rex responds immediately, yes, sir. Raymond raises his sword as golden energy surrounds him, his cloak whipping with the surge of power. Both knights launch forward in a coordinated charge cloaked in glowing aura as Raymond commands that the client's safety is their top priority and orders them to calm the Teresk even if they have to kill it. Below them, the massive creature's body heaves as the response understood. Echoes. Multiple long dark spikes pierce upward from within the Teresk's body, tearing through it from the inside. Debris including tables, barrels, and wooden structures erupts into the air as something massive forces its way out. A horrifying mass of writhing tentacles bursts forth, ending in a grotesque circular moth filled with teeth letting out a piercing screech. Nearby, Claire recoils in shock, shouting, "Is that an abomination?" While Jean looks up, repeating in disbelief, "An abomination?" Claire stares forward with wide, trembling eyes and sweat on her face as she says that a human turned into a monster because of the demonic realm's karma. Jean lowers his gaze with one eye glowing red as he says that is what an abomination is while repeating a human turned into a monster. Raymond exhales softly with his lips slightly parted as air escapes. He leaps upward with his sword glowing gold as he swings downward toward the massive creature's body looming above. Raymond drives a vertical golden slash straight through the creature's body as the attack sacred fire slash splits it open from top to bottom. He continues the downward motion of his strike as the creature's body separates along the glowing cut and blood sprays outward. Raymond turns his head sharply with a wide, shouting expression as he yells. Rex rushes forward along the ground, gripping his sword with both hands while looking up at the falling split creature. Rex swings his sword in a wide arc as a glowing golden slash slices through the creature and shatters it into spinning fragments. Chunks of the creature's flesh and broken pieces scatter across the ground as dark blood splashes outward in multiple directions. The creature's circular mouth lined with teeth turns violently as its fleshy interior twists and writhes. Raymond turns with a shocked expression and wide eyes as he shouts its body regenerated in weight. The monstrous creature looms directly behind Rex with its split mouth fully opened and glowing red eyes glaring downward while a voice calls out, "Rex." Rex turns his head with tense eyes and clenched teeth as he says, "Damn it." Raymond charges forward with his sword glowing gold and raised over his shoulder as he shouts, "Rex," while the monster's open mouth looms above Rex as he glances back. A severed arm tightly grips a sword as it flies through the air with blood trailing from it while the creature swallows Rex's body. Jean stares forward with widened eyes and a tense expression. Claire and two men beside her stare ahead with shocked expressions as their bodies stiffen in alarm. A gloved hand grips a weapon while blood sprays across the arm as Raymond lunges upward beneath it with a focused expression. Raymond narrows his eyes and grits his teeth with a tense expression as he says, "Damn it." He raises his glowing sword overhead as golden energy swirls around him while the monster's head faces him with blood dripping from its mouth. Raymond swings his glowing blade downward as he unleashes sacred fire slash and a bright golden arc cleaves through the monster's body with blood spraying outward. The monster's split mouth convulses as chunks of flesh tear apart and blood sprays outward while it roars. Raymond falls downward through the air with his cape flaring as he shouts Rex above the writhing monster's body. Raymond braces himself against the creature's surface with both hands while leaning forward and shouting, "Rex, hold on. I'll save you soon." Tall dark tendrils rise sharply from the ground around the fallen monster as they stretch upward in multiple directions while Raymond stands near it and shouts, "You can't give up." Jean turns his head with a tense expression as his eyes narrow slightly. Several long tendrils plunge downward toward Raymond as he crouches beside the monster's body. Jean grabs Raymond around the torso and pulls him away as spinning wind arcs cut through the attacking tendrils around them. Jean lands while holding Raymond in his arms as dust and debris scatter outward. Raymond collapses forward onto the ground with his body slumped and blood staining his side. Jean turns his head with a tense expression while people behind him look on in panic and shout that the Holy Knight is down and ask if they are all going to die at this rate. The grotesque monster stands upright with its swollen body and multiple tendrils writhing upward as its red eyes glow intensely. The monster's circular mouth opens wide at the top of its head with rows of teeth exposed while narration states that the abomination is a human who turned into a monster. Jean stares forward with glowing red eyes and a serious expression as he questions if continuing to consume internal cores will make him become like that someday. The monster's massive mouth gapes open with its tongue extended toward Jean standing below ready to attack while the narration states that worrying will not solve anything and that he needs to get rid of the abomination. Jean dashes forward with his cloak sweeping around him as multiple tendrils whip past him and the words "incredible digestion" appear. He spins his body and slashes through the thick tendrils with his sword cutting across their surfaces in a sweeping arc. The monster's upper body liquefies and reforms as its flesh drips and reshapes showing that its regeneration is endless. Jean twists his body while slipping between thick whipping tendrils as this fight becomes a battle of attrition. The monster's circular mouth remains wide open with jagged teeth exposed as its body sheds and regenerates while he states he must find its weakness while saving stamina. A massive tendril slams into Jin's raised blade as he braces and blocks the impact. Jin plants his feet wide and swings his sword in a powerful arc cutting through the air with force. He grits his teeth and tightens his expression while saying damn it as his cloak ripples around him. A spear spins rapidly through the air with sharp motion lines cutting across the sky. In the distance, Jonathan throws a spear at full force as it blasts forward with a shockwave toward the creature and splits the tendrils apart on impact. Jonathan stands in the distance facing Jean while smiling and saying we'll help too as Jean turns his head toward him. An open glowing book floats above an outstretched hand as light shines from its pages while a voice declares thy sword. Claire floats forward with her cloak and hair flowing as blue magic surrounds her body and she raises a glowing orb while declaring shall thwart evil. Two fighters step forward gripping their weapons as blue energy wraps around their legs while dark tendrils rise around their feet. A man raises his spear overhead and shouts. Its regeneration is slowing down thanks to the magic while others behind him yell stop the severed pieces from reattaching and we have to pull our way too. Jean turns his head slightly with a focused expression. Jin's lips curl into a small smile as he thinks not bad and notes they were not all scared out of their minds. Dark viscous droplets fall from above and splatter onto the ground forming ripples as they land. The creature's face bulges outward as glowing red eyes stare ahead while black fluid leaks from its eye sockets and viscous tendrils writhe across its head. Jean narrows his eyes and slightly parts his lips as he says its energy just changed. The creature's upper body twists unnaturally as another distorted face protrudes from its shoulder with its mouth hanging open. Multiple grotesque faces emerge across the creature's shoulders as it roars with its mouth wide open and red energy surrounds it. A distorted face with glowing eyes stretches across the creature's shoulder as a voice exclaims Heather's faces on the abomination's shoulders and declares those are the golden bug sons. Long black tendrils shoot outward from the creature's body in all directions as it stands with both arms raised. Several elongated tendrils whip through the air at high speed leaving blurred trails behind them. A tendril slams into the ground and spreads into a dark mass as a fighter recoils with his arm raised and shouts damn it while another voice yells it stole the flesh back. Several elongated tendrils rise upward from the creature's shoulders as fleshy lumps form at their tips and sway in the air. Jean launches forward through the air with his cloak trailing behind him as he extends his arm toward the mass of tendrils ahead. The creature's body fills the frame as its surface ripples and bulges with thick folds of flesh shifting across it. Jean grips his sword with both hands and brings it down as the blade crashes into the creature's body and blasts apart chunks of flesh. A distorted face embedded in the creature's body opens its mouth wide and lets out a roar as the space around it warps. Jean blocks a whipping tendril with his sword as it strikes against the blade and splashes dark fluid outward. Jin's foot slams against the ground as dust and debris scatter from the impact. Jonathan clenches his fist and shouts are you alright Jean while Jean turns and replies I'm fine but be careful as he warns that thing got stronger. The creature stands with its massive mouth wide open and rows of teeth exposed as a voice questions was it when the golden bug's faces appeared and asks what do we do now? Jean turns his head slightly with a focused gaze and says they just have to keep hacking away at it and that if they keep cutting eventually only the internal core will be left while noting the problem is its regeneration speed. Jonathan grips his spear with a confident smile and says if that's the issue don't worry just as it got stronger and adds they've learned its attack patterns too. Jin's lips curl into a faint smile as he says if you say. He raises his sword as purple energy surrounds the blade while he declares he will slice it up to his heart's content with these mana arts. The creature looms forward with glowing red eyes and its massive mouth open as Jean rushes toward it and shouts here I go. Jean swings his sword in a wide arc as purple energy trails behind the blade and multiple tendrils are sliced apart with blood spraying outward. Jean twists his body midair and brings his blade down again as the purple aura carves through the creature's flesh leaving deep cuts across its surface. Jin's blade tears across the creature's upper body as blood sprays outward and a voice shouts stop it from regenerating while the creature lets out a distorted cry. Multiple rapid slashes carve through the creature's flesh in diagonal streaks as its face twists and black fluid spills from its eyes. A close-up of a distorted face shows its eye widening and mouth opening as the slicing continues across its body. Jean drives his sword downward with both hands as a glowing blue core is revealed beneath the torn flesh while dark tendrils reach toward it. Jean stares forward with a glowing red eye and a calm expression as he declares it's over. Jean cleaves through the exposed core with a downward strike as purple energy splits it apart and blood bursts outward. Jonathan grips his spear while breathing heavily as another fighter behind him also pants. Claire stands beside an injured Raymond as she looks forward with a shocked expression while he sits slumped with his armor damaged. Fragments of the glowing blue core break apart and fall to the ground as pieces bounce and scatter across the dirt. The shattered core pieces lie on the ground with tendril-like extensions twitching slightly as their glow dims. A fighter raises his fist high and shouts "We won," while others behind him cheer and celebrate as a voice says to think they took down such a terrifying abomination and that their reputation is going to shoot up. Jean stands with his cloak draped over his shoulders as he looks forward and a voice says "Great work everyone." Jean lowers his gaze with a serious expression as his eyes focus downward. A small blue core fragment sits on the ground in front of Jean with viscous fluid dripping from its surface. A fighter runs forward with a wide grin and shouts "You rascal, you survived too," as he moves between the trees. A woman with long red hair places her hand against a tree while looking toward the group gathered in the distance. The red-haired woman leans against the tree with her hand resting on her chest as she says, "The golden bug sons Derek and Cedric, in the end you were no different from your father," and softly adds, "Poor things." She lowers her gaze with her eyes half closed and a faint frown as she says, "How could they be so utterly incompetent and useless?" From behind the tree she watches Jean walking away with the glowing blue core and wonders if that is the man who fought the abomination. Jean grips the glowing core tightly in his hand as its surface pulses with light while a voice questions who is he. Jean turns his head slightly with a calm expression as a voice asks why he is taking the internal core. Jean sits cross-legged on the ground beside a small campfire while holding a cloak in his hands with tents glowing faintly in the forest behind him. He lifts a glowing blue core in his hand and stares at it with a focused expression. He brings the glowing blue core to his mouth and bites into it with his teeth visible. He squeezes his eyes shut with a strained expression. A gagged man lies strapped to a stone slab with his eyes wide in panic as Jean realizes this is someone's memory. Jean appears transparently over the strapped man while staring down at him with a shocked expression. The gagged man stares upward in fear while the masked red-haired woman stands beside him and says his father Golden Bug died because of his incompetence. The masked red-haired woman stands beside the strapped man in the stone room and tells him to show results if he wants to live while he muffles through his gag. She looks down at the man while holding a small vial and tells him to show how special he is as he muffles desperately. The red-haired woman smiles while holding a vial filled with glowing blue liquid and says she will see if he is worth joining her. She forces glowing blue liquid into the strapped man's eye as dark veins spread across his body and he screams through his gag. The man screams as black tendrils burst from his eye and blue liquid runs down his face. Jin's face tightens with wide eyes and clenched teeth as sweat runs down his cheek. A strand of saliva shoots from Jin's mouth as he spits forward. Jean rushes toward the forest clearing in a hurry as a curved trail of flames erupts behind him. Jean crashes to the ground bracing himself as liquid spills from his mouth onto the floor. Jean hunches forward while wiping his mouth and breathing heavily as it is stated that eating an internal core can rarely grant the monster's power or make him absorb its memories. Jean looks downward with drool and sweat dripping from his face as he thinks these internal cores are full of side effects. Jean walks through the forest while wiping his mouth as he wonders if the memory came from one of the golden bug's sons who turned into abominations after something was poured into their eyes. Jean stares at a small vial with blue liquid dripping from its tip while sweat runs down his face as it is stated that abominations are created when humans are influenced by karma, and he questions if the liquid contained karma. A red-haired woman in a dark outfit holds a small container in her hand while it is mentioned in that case. Is that woman? Jean narrows his eyes with sweat trailing down his face as he says a dark priest. Claire stands behind Jean in the forest as she says, "Jean, we need to leave now." Jean turns his head toward her with a sweat drop on his cheek as she asks, "Oh my, why are you sweating so much?" Jean raises his hand to his mouth while Claire faces him with crossed arms as she says, "What happened? And don't tell me you didn't eat another internal core, did you?" Jean lowers his hand slightly while looking to the side as he thinks about whether he should tell the others and how he could explain seeing a monster's memories as a side effect of an internal core. Jean walks ahead with a calm expression while Claire follows behind him as it is stated that saying unnecessary things might cause a misunderstanding, and he says, "Don't worry, it's nothing," while deciding to keep it a secret for now. A dark figure stands partially hidden behind a tree in the forest while strands of Claire's hair appear in the foreground. The red-haired woman tilts her head slightly with a calm expression. Jean walks ahead while raising his hand mid-gesture as Claire follows beside him with tents visible in the background. The red-haired woman narrows her eyes while peeking from behind the tree. Jean stands facing Raymond and Jonathan beside Claire as Raymond gestures with his hand while speaking. The red-haired woman leans against the tree with one hand near her lips as she says, "Is he plotting something? And to think someone who eats raw internal cores is doing the same work as the Order Alliance." She lightly touches her lips with her gloved finger as she says, "I'm curious. The red-haired woman lifts her veil with both hands while watching the group walking away in the distance as she says, "When I meet him again, will we be allies or enemies?" A tall rocky cliff rises behind several freshly placed graves marked with swords planted into the ground. Raymond grips the hilt of his sword while another sword remains planted in a grave as Claire clasps her hands in prayer and Jean stands behind them with others gathered. A shadow stretches across a grave marked by a planted sword as it is said, "I offer my prayers to E, the god of harmony." Raymond stands with both hands on the sword as he says, "He was braver than anyone. He dedicated his entire life to peace." The scene widens over the graves and forest as he says, "Please watch over him so that this life's passing is not in vain." Jean looks forward with a calm expression as it is stated that even though they only dueled once he looked young and it is a shame. Raymond turns his head slightly with a sharp gaze. He looks up with widened eyes as he shouts, "Wait, is that?" Raymond tilts his head up toward a glowing silhouette of a wolf standing on top of a tall rock as someone exclaims, "A red wolf." The red wolf stands firmly on the rock with its glowing blue eyes and tendrils lifted as a low growl echoes. Raymond drops to one knee while gripping his large sword planted into the ground and his cloak flares around him as he declares, "I give thanks." He kneels with one hand over his chest while holding the sword as Jean beside him looks down and asks, "What are you doing all of a sudden?" And he replies, "I am expressing my gratitude for the comfort of E, the god of harmony." The red wolf tilts its head back with its mouth wide open in a yawn as it exhales while the statement is made that the red wolf is considered the closest companion of E, the god of harmony. Raymond keeps his eyes closed with one hand gripping the sword and the other resting on his chest as it is stated that the appearance of a red wolf means E is comforting them. He suddenly turns his head toward Jean while keeping his sword planted as Jean leans back in surprise and says, "That's just my pet mutt though." While Raymond shouts blasphemy, "How dare you call a red wolf a mutt? Furthermore, that monster is not a species that can be tamed." Jean stands beside Raymond while looking forward with a calm expression as he thinks, "He doesn't believe me," and says, "Hey mutt." He stares forward with glowing red eyes and a serious expression as he says, "Stop acting out and come here." The red wolf jerks its head forward with its ears raised and eyes wide as it lets out a startled cry. The red wolf launches off the rock and divvies downward with its body stretched forward and claws extended as debris scatters from the cliff. The red wolf lands heavily on the ground in front of Jean with its front paw raised and body lowered while Raymond behind him reacts in shock and says, "What? It's true." Raymond stands facing forward with a tense expression as it is stated that the red wolf is a monster that even the order could not tame and he says, "How could a mere individual?" Jean stands calmly while holding the red wolf's paw in his hand as he says, "Oh, I just killed a werewolf and it's been following me ever since." Raymond tilts his head slightly with a confused expression as he says, "What is this guy?" He turns his head to the side with a serious gaze. The red wolf stands beside a stone grave with its eyes half-lidded and mouth slightly open while a sword is planted upright in the grave nearby. Jean turns his head slightly as he listens while Raymond asks, "Jean, may I ask you a favor?" Raymond stands with the red wolf behind him and looks ahead as he says, "If the red wolf doesn't have a name, please name it Rex." He faces forward with a stern expression as he says, "For one, taking a monster that our order considers sacred and calling it mud is a bit inappropriate." Jean stands quietly with his head slightly lowered while Raymond grips his sword and says, "Secondly, with the single-minded resolve to purify the entire demonic realm, I wish for Rex's will which fought against the evil to not end here." A hand tightly grips a sword stained with blood against a dark surface as it is stated that he did not let go of his sword until the very end. Raymond closes his eyes while holding his sword upright in front of him as he says, "Please, let that red wolf carry on his legacy under the name of Rex." Jean looks upward with a neutral expression as the red wolf's tail passes behind him and he thinks Rex's legacy. The red wolf lifts its head slightly with its eyes half open while Jean looks toward it and asks, "Are you okay with that?" The red wolf turns its head sideways with a narrowed eye and a low breath leaving its mouth. Jean tilts his head with a faint smile while saying, "In that case, I will name him Rex." Raymond faces Jean with softened eyes and a gentle expression as he says, "Thank you." An elderly man steps forward using a cane as Raymond turns sharply with widened eyes and says, "Oh my, did this old man appear at a bad time?" The elderly monk walks forward with a cane while another monk follows behind and Raymond faces him and says, "Elder." Jean looks toward the approaching elder with a serious expression as the thought appears. If he's an elder, doesn't that make him one of the highest authorities in the area? The elderly monk stands upright surrounded by a glowing golden aura as the title identifies him as the elder of the third pioneer city, Bo. Several pairs of boots step forward across the dirt ground. A group of men in armor and cloaks moves forward together. Raymond stands facing the elderly monk with one hand resting near his chest, while a crowd gathers behind him and he says, "Welcome, Elder." Bo leans slightly on his cane while facing Raymond and says, "I apologize for visiting during such a grieving time," as Raymond responds, "Not at all, Elder. What brings you here, though?" Bo turns his head slightly with a serious expression and says, "I've come because an investigation is needed regarding the deaths of the Golden Bug Sons." Raymond looks toward the Elder and says, "Hold on." Jean stands with narrowed eyes in front of others while looking toward the Elder, and Raymond says, "Do you still think their deaths were the work of these people?" Jean looks forward and says, "Wait, were we under suspicion? I guess it makes sense. The clients died while we were transporting their massive fortune, so it's only natural to suspect the mercenaries." Raymond faces the Elder and says, "Was my evidence not enough?" As the Elder responds, "No, it was plenty." Bo turns his head slightly with a stern expression and says, "However." He stands beside Raymond while facing Jean and says, "As to how they ended up turning into abominations, nothing has been revealed yet." Bo leans forward gripping his cane while facing Jean and says, "I can smell the stench of a dark priest all over this incident." He turns his head toward Jean while looking down at him and asks, "What do you think, Jean?" Jean stares ahead with a tense eye as his expression sharpens and thinks, "He knows my name. Don't tell me this guy." He faces forward and says, "Are you suspecting me of being a dark priest?" Bo stands still with a calm expression in silence. The scene shifts to an arena, identifying the place as the third pioneer city Vritro Arena. An empty arena interior stretches out with wooden platforms, stairs, weapon racks, and lit torches along the walls. Jean stands ahead while the monk stands with his cane behind him and says, "People who are as strong as you usually show their talent from a young age." Bo stands still and says, "But you just appeared out of nowhere one day and started pulling off one massive feat after another." He lowers his head and says, "And on top of that, you coincidentally got involved in the abomination incident." He stands with his hands behind his back while Jean looks down at him as he says, "Don't you think that's highly suspicious, even to yourself?" Jean turns his head slightly and thinks, "I guess people around here keep tabs on who's strong well. In that case, it makes sense why I might seem shady, especially since I'm not from this world." His glowing red eye narrows with a tense, focused look as he thinks. Jean stands at a distance facing the Elder and Raymond while speaking and says, "What does that have to do with me sparring with you, Elder?" As it states, he cannot understand it. Raymond looks toward the Elder while speaking and says, "He's right, Elder, besides that mercenary just got out of a battle not long ago, so his body isn't in perfect condition." Jean stands with his back turned and thinks agreed, while the Elder faces him calmly and says, "So what?" Bo looks down with a stern expression and says, "Are you saying you're refusing to cooperate with the investigation?" Raymond stiffens with widened eyes while standing beside Jean and thinks he's completely unreasonable. Jean looks to the side with a tense expression while thinking, "What do I do? I can't just beat up a man who suspects me of being a dark priest, all because I am strong." Bo's face remains calm and unreadable, as the thought continues, plus, fighting an old man might be a bit too troublesome as well. The Elder stands with his cane dropped beside him while saying, "You seem to have a lot on your mind, are you worried just because I'm old?" He stands upright as a golden aura surrounds his body and says, "I appreciate the thought, but there's no need, the reason I rose to the position of Elder." His sandaled foot strikes the ground with force. Bo stands close and thrusts his glowing palm toward Jean while saying, "Was purely due to my own strength." Jean jerks his head back and grits his teeth while thinking he's fast. Bo's hand slices forward through the air while his prayer beads swing. His strike connects with force as a spiraling shockwave surrounds Jean while he performs Great Bell Strike. Jin's face twists in pain as blood sprays from his mouth. His body slams into the wall beside a burning brazier as debris scatters outward. Raymond looks forward with a shocked expression and shouts, "Jean," while stating that the Vritra monks are martial artists who possess incredible combat strength. Jean rises from the ground while covering his mouth with his hand as dust surrounds him, and it states that the Elder is the strongest among them. Bo stands forward cloaked in a swirling golden aura with one fist pulled back as he declares, "You must not let your guard down even for a second." And adds, "Raymond, aren't you being a bit biased?" He slides low across the ground while he says, "If you keep taking his side." Jean recoils with a bloodied mouth after a blow to his stomach while it states, "This old man might get jealous and lose control of his strength." Bo's palm slams into Jin's torso with force. Jean pushes the Elder away with his hand mid-strike. The Elder stands with fingers slightly curled as a golden aura surrounds him. Jean stands with blood on his mouth and looks forward as he thinks he caught the blade with his bare hands. And that hurt a lot. He also hit the exact same spot the abomination got me. His eyes widen sharply as he stares ahead in shock while thinking, "No, wait a second. Jean grips his sword and scans his body with a startled expression as he thinks, my body is completely healed. And those injuries from fighting the abomination should have left me bedridden for at least 2 weeks, no. An image shows a monstrous arm colliding with his raised sword as the impact bursts outward. He stares at his hand with blood on his lips while thinking even the damage from that attack just now is slowly healing. And don't tell me. A grotesque open maw looms behind him as he faces forward with glowing eyes while thinking, did eating that monster core give me the abomination's regeneration abilities? He tilts his head slightly with a grin as the declaration appears, this is a total jackpot. He swings his sword at the elder while the elder raises his arm and deflects the strike and he jerks back. Bo clenches his fist as a golden aura surrounds him while he says, you call this being injured from battle and you sure know how to get an old man fired up. He smiles faintly beneath his blindfold as a golden aura surrounds him while saying, I'd love to spar with him some more if allowed but I can't go acting so childishly. His palm strikes Jin's chest with a heavy impact as debris flies outward while he says, now that I've confirmed the rumors about your strength, it's time to move on to the next step. Bo raises his hand to his blindfold as a golden aura surrounds him while he says, namely, using my mind's eye. A glowing circular symbol rests on the elder's blindfold as a golden aura surrounds his head and body. Jin stares forward with widened eyes as a large glowing circular symbol shines in front of him. Bo presses his hands together in front of his chest as dark streaks run from his eyes and says, emptying oneself is the way to become truly one with yourself and I gave up my 2 eyes for the mind's eye to open my 3rd eye. Jin faces the elder as a large glowing circular symbol radiates between them while the elder stands calmly and says, it is an eye of the heart that pierces through to the essence of the soul. Jin's face appears tinted in deep blue as he stares forward while the elder says, now show me Jin, whether you are a dark priest or a rising new light. A green monstrous creature with elongated limbs and a gaping mouth stands hunched in a dark void. A green creature with long limbs looms forward in a dark void. A grotesque surface covered in numerous red slit pupil eyes glares outward intensely. A glowing golden circular symbol radiates in darkness as a commanding voice declares, begone, you beasts, get back. A sandaled footsteps into shallow water creating ripples as it moves forward. Bo stands in a misty forest clearing as he turns his head in alert silence. His face tenses with sweat forming while he says, my goodness is this. He stands surrounded by multiple shadowy beasts with glowing red eyes towering around him as the space forms Jin's mental world. Jin taps the elder's shoulder with a sharp jolt as his body reacts to the contact. Jin leans forward with his hand slightly raised toward the elder and asks, are you alright, elder? As it is noted, he is unable to sense Bo's mana. The elder breathes heavily with sweat running down his face as he says, a mental world that goes beyond unpleasant and straight into terrifying. This is the first time I've seen something like this. The elder's face is covered in sweat with a tense expression as he thinks, still, his mental world hasn't completely collapsed. So it means he's not a dark priest in that case. Jin stands facing the elder as the elder presses his palms together at his chest and Jin calls out elder. Bo turns slightly with his palms together and says calmly, I apologize Jin. Please forgive this old man for his rudeness. Verifying whether you were a dark priest or not was incredibly important. While Jin looks at him in confusion and says, what's this all of a sudden? Jin stands with Raymond behind him and a girl at the open doorway as a voice says, it is because I wanted to entrust you with a quest related to the dark priests. Jin turns his head to the side with a serious expression and says, you are. A girl steps forward across the ground as she says, it's a pleasure to meet you. The girl stands facing forward with a calm expression as she says, I am Cindy, the youngest daughter of the golden bug. The forest stands still as leaves sway and rustling echoes around the trees. Cindy walks ahead on a forest path as Jin and the elder follow behind her while she says that this is not the first time an abomination has appeared. She looks forward as she says that recently with the 3rd pioneer city as the epicenter, many people have been turning into abominations and even the surrounding forests are rapidly becoming corrupted into the demonic realm. Jin turns his head to the side with a tense expression. His eye widens sharply as a voice says, we have arrived. Jin and the others look forward as several figures in white robes kneel ahead around a massive purple rift core emitting a glowing light in the forest. A large pulsing mass with multiple tendril-like extensions and glowing core spreads outward as it is identified as a rift core, an object that spreads the demonic realm and turns surrounding areas into it. 3 robed figures kneel with their hands pressed together as they pray, have pity on us and bestow mercy upon this land. While golden light surrounds them, the robed figures remain kneeling with hands clasped as glowing particles drift around them while they say, we offer our prayers. 3 masked figures in dark robes extend tube-like devices toward the rift core as streams of water spray onto its surface. Several robed figures kneel and continue praying while masked figures spray water onto the pulsing rift core as bright golden light surrounds it. Jean faces forward with a focused expression as he says, purifying a rift core does not seem to be an easy task. He lowers his gaze slightly as he says, but was not the power of karma supposed to weaken the further you get from the Northern Empire? While Cindy beside him responds, yes, you are correct. Jean turns his head slightly with narrowed eyes as he says, so for something like this to be happening. Cindy turns her head forward with a firm expression and says, yes. She looks ahead as she says, it means there is someone behind it. Jean stares forward with a hardened expression as he thinks, a dark priest. Cindy walks ahead while Jean follows behind her as she says, if the number of abominations and rift cores continues to increase at the current rate, the third pioneer city that we worked so hard to build will face great danger. The elder walks beside Jean while saying in the worst case scenario, the elder tilts his face upward as he says, we could lose the entire city. He stands with his cane while facing Jean and Cindy on the forest path as he says that is why they meticulously tried to find the dark priest hideout and have finally found the suspected location of their base. He raises his head slightly as he says, so with that said, the elder looks toward Jean and says, would you join us in the extermination operation in 2 weeks? As Cindy stands nearby and adds, we will compensate you with the highest level of pay. Jean holds a focused gaze as he thinks, so this is what they wanted to hire me for. He looks toward the elder and Cindy as he thinks, Bo, the elder of the third pioneer city and Cindy, the only left descendant of the golden bug. His lips curl into a faint smile as he thinks, a request from such big shots, have I finally been acknowledged? Jean looks forward with a confident smirk forming on his face. Dark clouds stretch across the night sky above. A wide grassy field spreads outward as Teresk stands along a path while a voice says, do not even mention it. I was so worried, you know. Jean walks beside Claire as she says, if you are framed as a dark priest, death is a given. Followed by, and I heard they brutally torture you too. He glances sideways with a tense expression while a spiked iron torture device stands behind him and he says, they would torture me. Claire clasps her hands together with a bright expression as she says, we have finally arrived. While Jean stiffens slightly, Jean looks forward with widened eyes and says, so that is. A distant fortified city stretches behind tall walls and open fields as it is identified as Wall City Yugas. A massive city spreads outward as narration states, incomparable to the pioneer cities, but the safest place in this world. Jean looks forward with a calm expression as he wonders if he will be able to live here someday. Jean looks at Raymond standing beside Teresk as he acknowledges that now is not the time and calls out to Raymond. Raymond turns his head sharply with a stern expression. Several people sit and lean against the Teresk while resting on the ground as a voice says everyone will take a short break before moving on. A wide view shows multiple people gathered around the Teresk. Some resting while others stand in place. Jonathan leans toward Jean with a shocked expression as he shouts what you are leaving for the third pioneer city as Jean responds, yes, I got a new request. Jonathan looks at Jean as he says but that is so sudden and adds that going separate ways after a job is done is how it goes in this business but it is always a bit sad. Jean looks ahead with a calm expression as he says indeed you are right and asks what will all of you do now. Jonathan smirks and gives a thumbs up as he says, well, I guess I will have some drinks and then drink some more. While another voice adds same here. Jean turns his head toward Claire while holding his bag and says what about you Claire? Claire closes her eyes with a faint smile and says, well, I guess I will have to look for another job. And he asks did you make enough money this time? Claire faces Jean with a composed expression as he looks back at her and she says it was a decent payout but she is still far short of the money she needs to go to the magic tower. Jean looks at Claire with a slightly surprised expression and says the magic tower. Claire turns her head slightly with a gentle smile and says I call myself a mage but in the end I have just gathered common knowledge so my skills are barely past the beginner level. She walks beside Jean with a soft expression and says, well, it is not like I have a problem making a living right now. It is just that I got greedy and I want to learn higher class magic. Claire stands smiling as a grand library-like structure rises behind her while she says that is why she is saving money to attend the magic tower and that you can learn higher class magic there. Jean looks to the side with a thoughtful expression as he thinks is the magic tower like a magical university and adds an earning money just to study that is admirable. He tilts his head and murmurs softly. He stands and opens his bag as Claire beside him watches closely. Jean lifts a tied pouch in one hand and looks at Claire with a faint smile as he asks, will this be enough? The pouch hangs slightly open with coins inside as he says this should be enough to help you get to the magic tower. Claire raises both hands with a startled expression as she says, what no way I could not possibly be that shameless. How could I accept that? Jonathan stands behind Claire with a serious expression as Jean holds the pouch and Claire looks at him while he says, I am not just giving it away for free. I am giving it because I am indebted to you, Claire. Consider it a gift. Jonathan scratches the back of his head with a wide grin as he says, that is a huge amount. Claire looks forward with a conflicted expression as she says, still for me too. She looks at him in surprise with widened eyes as Jean extends his hand and places the pouch into her grasp. Jean turns his head toward Claire with a faint smile as he says, I will see you again. Claire stares forward with wide eyes and flushed cheeks as she remains silent. A close view shows Claire's lips pressed together as her cheeks remain flushed. Claire's hand grabs Jin's cloak tightly from behind. She holds his cloak while standing close to him under the trees and she says, thank you, Jean. She looks forward with a determined expression as she says, I will definitely repay this favor. Jean looks back with a calm expression as his eyes soften in silence. He stands facing the group and says, take care, everyone. Claire clutches the pouch to her chest as Jonathan waves beside her with his eyes closed. Jean turns his head away with his cloak shifting slightly. He walks forward with his head lowered as the group stands behind him watching. Rex lies stretched out in the grass while Raymond stands nearby looking down at him. Raymond looks toward Rex with a softened expression as he gently calls out. He holds a faint smile with his eyes relaxed while looking ahead. Jean walks toward the city with Rex beside him under the sunset sky as Raymond says, take care too, Rex. Jean walks forward past armored guards beneath the stone wall. He carries a sack over his shoulder while turning his head slightly to the side. The elder monk stands on the wall beside Cindy and she says, you said nothing would happen, but seeing you come out here like this, you must be worried. The elder keeps his head forward while Cindy looks ahead and says, what are you talking about? And she replies, what do you mean I'm talking about that mercenary? Cindy narrows her eyes slightly as she says, you said it yourself, elder. She looks at him with a composed expression and says, that Jean seems to have eaten a monster core. The elder remains still with his face tense and stays silent. His mouth tightens beneath his blindfold as he says, just because he ate a monster core, it doesn't seem right to consider him a dark priest. He stands facing forward as Cindy looks up at him with a sharp expression and says, you're saying something incredibly dangerous. If you eat a monster core, you become intoxicated with power and lose your sense of self. Isn't that basic common sense? Cindy closes her eyes and she says, elder no master, please tell me honestly, and says, do you still hope that that guy still has his humanity left and that's why you're protecting Jean? The elder stands still while looking forward with a steady expression. A short-haired figure appears wearing a beaded necklace and lifting a mask over his face. The elder lowers his head with a heavy expression as he remains silent. Both stand on the castle wall facing ahead and Bo says, I don't really want to have that conversation. Cindy's lips tighten and she says, I apologize if I was disrespectful, but keep this in mind. She steps down from the box and walks away while saying, I'll keep it a secret for now, but if Jean does anything wrong, I will frame him as a dark priest. She turns her head slightly with a cold expression and says, if that happens, you who recommended Jean won't be safe either, elder. She walks forward across the stone wall as the elder stands behind holding his cane. The elder lifts his head slightly and says, don't worry, that won't happen. Dark silhouettes of monstrous creatures loom around a figure standing beneath them. As he says, Jean has consumed numerous monster cores and become unimaginably strong, yet his mental world remains intact. The elder lowers his head with a firm expression as he states this is proof that one can maintain their humanity even after eating monster cores. Armored guards walk with spears as he says the world is not ready to accept Jean yet, so he is keeping this fact a secret. He stands alone on the wall beside a fluttering flag as he says, Jean walks forward while glancing to the side as the narration states the power that young man possesses. He walks forward while looking to the side as the narration states, it will bring great hope to this world. Rows of armored soldiers march forward with spears raised as flags ripple in the wind. A line of soldiers advances in formation with steady faces while moving together as the force is identified as the 1st Expeditionary Force. A soldier in the front walks forward holding his spear as he says, just as there is a time to love and a time to hate, if there is a time for peace, there is a time to fight. Two spear tips clash midair with a sharp impact as they strike together. Several soldiers march with spears in hand as one says, he pointed to my hands and commanded me to hold a sword. A spear slams into the ground as dirt bursts outward. A soldier walks forward holding a spear while speaking and saying, and pointing to my heart, he said, to annihilate evil with faith. Jean strikes his own forehead with a stone as blood splashes across his face with a pained expression. He stands still holding a blood-stained stone as nearby soldiers stare at him in shock. The blood-stained stone drops from his hand and hits the ground. Jean looks down with blood running down his face as he calmly counts, 596 to 597, while a soldier reacts in confusion and says, "What's with that guy?" His forehead splits open revealing writhing flesh beneath as he counts, 598-599-600, while blood pours down. The exposed wound visibly regenerates as the flesh closes and reforms. Jean touches his forehead with his hand as he states that he obtained the special ability regeneration after consuming monster cores and that healing a simple bruise took about 10 minutes. His blood-streaked face looks forward as he states that the fracture he received from the abomination healed in 2 days. A faint smile forms on Jin's lips with blood trailing down his cheek as he says, then, Jean looks at his hand with a bloodied face and says that if his arm gets cut off he wonders if it can regenerate within a month, followed by, "Yeah, this is why I eat monster cores. I want to try using it in actual combat right away." He stands facing his soldier as he hears, "I heard your nickname is Head Crusher. Was that about crushing your own head?" Jean lifts his hand to his head while looking at the man and says, "I apologize if I startled you," and says that there was something he wanted to try out. An armored man stands confidently while looking at Jean as he is identified as the Expeditionary Force Supreme Commander Roland. Roland gestures casually toward Jean while smiling and says, "No, I like geniuses like you. Geniuses are supposed to be completely messed up in the head." He points at Jean with a smirk as Jean says, "Genius." And he replies, "I'm talking about you. You're a mercenary recommended by Elderbow, so you must be an incredible genius." Jean stares forward with a tense expression as he says, "What's with this guy calling me a genius? I don't really want to get close to him." And says, "More importantly, what's our plan?" Roland turns his head and says, "Spoken like a true genius, you're impatient." He gestures with one hand and says they are heading to the forest north of the third pioneer city and will first clear out the rift cores ahead before moving into their center as Jean stands behind him. A distant view of the forested area and rocky terrain appears as he says they will not know the exact duration of the battle until they arrive, but their goal is to finish within 10 days. Jean looks to the side with a calm expression and says that the forest should not be that big and asks if 10 days would be too long. Roland raises a finger with a confident smile and says, as expected of a genius, "Yeah, normally, that would be a long time." The ground bulges behind the soldiers as he says, but a large clawed monster lunges through the air with its mouth wide open behind Roland as Roland looks forward and says that because of the rift cores the monster's territory has expanded. A soldier in a helmet shouts, "Commander," while Jean stands beside him looking forward. Roland grips the hilt of his sword at his waist and pulls it out. He swings his sword in a wide arc as the blade cuts through the lunging monster and blood bursts from its body midair. Roland looks forward with a confident grin and says that those who usually live deep within the demonic realm are appearing out in the open like this, so 10 days is actually a short time. The ground bulges in multiple directions as several creatures rush toward them. Several armored soldiers recoil and stumble back while holding their spears as the ground bulges around them and one shouts, "Ambush, everyone prepare for battle." A monster lunges forward with its mouth wide open as it rushes toward the soldiers. A soldier is bitten by multiple monsters as blood sprays from his body while he cries out in pain. Jean with blood on his face looks alarmed and thinks, "Leech rats, have those guys always been able to dig underground?" Roland shouts urgently, "Keep your backs covered while you fight. If you show your back to them you're dead." Several armored soldiers brace with their spears as multiple leech-like monsters swarm from all directions and lunge at them. Roland raises his sword mid-swing with a shocked expression as he looks at Jean. He shouts with urgency, "Hey genius, watch out." His eye widens in shock as he registers the danger. Jean is surrounded as multiple creatures leap at him from every direction with claws outstretched. They lunge at him as he lowers his head, overwhelmed by the swarm. Jean keeps his head lowered as multiple leech rats surround him with open jaws and raised claws closing in. Roland reaches forward with a shocked expression and shouts, "Hey, what are you doing? Are you crazy?" Jean grips a short blade and drives it into a leech rat's body as blood bursts from the wound. He bites into the leech core as blood sprays across his mouth. Jean clamps his jaws onto several leech rats as blood sprays across his face. His eye widens and glows red as he thinks, "If I eat all of these guys, wouldn't I be able to inherit the leech rat's abilities? I don't really think I need the ability to dig underground, but..." He bites into a glowing core with a bloodied grin as he thinks, "This is a problem. The monsters right in front of my eyes only look like monster cores to me." Jean grips a core embedded in a creature's flesh. He bites into a leech rat's body as blue fluid splashes across his mouth. He stuffs a glowing core into his mouth while surrounded by lunging beasts as inheritance occurs when consuming a monster core with a very low chance of gaining that monster's skill. Jean holds a dripping blue core in his hand as it is revealed that this is the real secret to how I survived in the demonic realm for 12 years. He tilts his head with blood smeared across his face and exhales. Jean stands surrounded by leech rats and says, I am starting to get full. I think I have eaten about 40 of them now. Should I have gained a digging ability by now? A hand reaches toward him from above as beasts recoil with open jaws. A knight reaches out with his arm raised toward Jean as beasts crowd around him and shouts, Mercenary, are you alright? Jean stares ahead with wide eyes and a bloodied face and shouts, What are you doing? It is dangerous. I am fine, so maintain your formation. And thinks, what the? I cannot secretly eat monster cores like this. The knight grabs Jean and pulls him away while moving at speed as he says, Do not worry, we are safe. A group of robed musicians strike drums and play string instruments as glowing notes swirl around them and the holy choir performs. Roland plays a violin with a calm expression as glowing musical notes spiral around him. A hooded musician draws a bow across a large string instrument behind another choir member. Roland tilts his head with a slight smile while playing. Armored knights stand with spears as leech rats lunge at them while one shouts, I am overflowing with power and another commands slaughter them all. Jean looks forward with a shocked expression as glowing musical notes drift around him and he realizes the soldiers' stamina and defense have increased significantly while questioning if they are receiving buffs from the holy songs. Roland tilts his head while playing the violin as glowing notes swirl around him and Jean realizes he is actually a supporter. A knight shouts with his mouth wide open as others behind him stand charging forward. A leech rat is struck midair as blood sprays while soldiers advance and the command echoes. All troops, it is time to counterattack. The full moon hangs in the night sky above the tree. A pile of dead leech rats lies on the ground as an announcement states they will record performance and asks everyone who participated in today's battle to gather around. A knight holds a megaphone and a paper while speaking toward the group as he explains the recorded results will reflect their rewards and asks for cooperation. Two men sit near a small fire beside tents as one looks toward the other and says, Seriously, I just cannot figure him out smashing his own head with a rock charging right into the middle of the monsters. Jean kneels inside a tent and digs into the ground as dirt scatters while someone asks, Why are you digging in the dirt? He wipes his mouth with the back of his hand and frowns as he says, Did I really not gain the digging ability? While adding, gaining an inheritance definitely requires luck. Roland stands nearby and looks at Jean as he asks, Jean, is your body doing alright? And Jean turns toward him. Jean glances back with a calm expression and says, I am sorry if I startled you earlier. Roland smiles slightly as he replies, Not at all, your fighting today was impressive. And adds, Honestly, when you jumped right into that horde of monsters, I thought you were going to die. Jean looks at him as Roland continues, But you proved yourself with the results in the end and asks, I heard you hunted 267 leech rats all by yourself. Two men rest near the tent as one cleans a spear and says, The average soldier only took down 4 or 5, while even the holy knights were only around the 100 to 150 mark. Roland tilts his head with a faint smile as he says, I guess prodigies really are different. Jean turns his head and thinks, Prodigy my foot, if I had just focused on hunting instead of stuffing my face with monster cores, the numbers would have been completely reversed. And says, By the way, Roland. He places a hand on his chest while looking toward Roland and asks, Were you part of the support force? Roland leans forward with a confused expression and says, What about it? And adds, Are you looking down on supporters? Jean lifts his hand slightly while calmly explaining, I just thought you were someone interested in raw power, so I was just surprised since it was not what I had expected. Roland closes his eyes and coughs into his fist with a bead of sweat on his face as he says, Well, you saw right through me. He crosses his arms and looks aside while admitting, In my heart, I am the kind of man who wants to wield a sword too. As Jean gestures toward him and says, Then should you not just wield one? And Roland continues, The thing is, Roland lowers his gaze with a serious expression as he says, The reason the Order Alliance fights is for peace. Two figures stand before several graves under the moonlight, as Roland explains that countless people have lost their homes, and are dying because of the demonic realm, and that in a world like this, he chose the role where he could be of the most help. Roland smiles with his eyes closed and gestures with his hand, as he says his swordsmanship is only slightly better than average, but his musical skills are considered top tier even within the Order Alliance. Jean stares forward as he thinks that when Roland kept talking about prodigies, he assumed he would be annoying. Roland smiles warmly, as the narration states that he seems like a much more decent person than expected. The night sky stretches over the camp with the full moon shining as a voice asks if he can show his performance sometime, and another replies with a laugh saying, Yes, sure. Two flags flap in the wind against the dark sky. A view of the camp shows soldiers standing near tents, as the narration states 1 week later. The camp tents stand under daylight, as the narration explains they advance into the demonic realm, while destroying numerous rift cores, and encountering kobolds and large-eared monsters. Roland stands at the head of the table facing the group, as he states that the deeper they go the stronger the monsters become, and asks how the soldiers' morale is. A soldier in armor gestures with his hand toward Roland, as he reports that they are far more spirited than when they first started, while another voice hesitates saying well, and Roland responds pardon. A group of kobold monsters charge forward with weapons raised. Jean swings his sword in a wide arc as multiple monsters are cut apart, and their bodies are thrown into the air with blood spraying. A massive rabbit-like monster with glowing red eyes lunges forward, as Jean braces below it with his sword raised. Jean slashes upward with his sword as blood bursts across the frame. He bites into a glowing blue core. Jean grips the core in his hand while looking toward it with blood on his lips, and says damn it, another dud. Roland looks ahead with a serious expression, as a voice says that Mercenary is taking care of every single monster as soon as they appear. Roland smirks slightly as he exhales. He throws his head back while laughing loudly at the table as the others stand around him, and asks if getting outdone by a single mercenary hurts the pride of the Order Alliance. A stern armored man folds his arms and gestures forward, as he says this is not a laughing matter, and that the soldiers are far too relaxed, and he is going to claim a massive amount of the performance rewards. Roland looks forward calmly as he says a good thing is a good thing, and thanks to him they barely have any casualties, and that stronger monsters appearing means their destination is close. A view of the camp shows tents and flags under the sky, as a voice says they should rest while they still can. A deep canyon stretches downward between tall cliffs. Several figures stand on top of tall stone pillars rising from the canyon depths. A masked figure with a single eye symbol looks forward while asking if the Order Alliance is on their way. He stands on a stone pillar in the canyon as he looks to the side and asks how those people found out about this place. He stands atop a pillar facing a veiled woman below as she looks ahead, and says we planted many rift cores around here, and it would be stranger if they had not grown suspicious. The woman closes her eyes calmly as she says she still believes their youngest anticipated this much when she made her move. She opens her red eyes and smiles faintly as she says their chosen youngest sibling could not possibly be that incompetent. Figures stand on tall stone pillars in a canyon as a lone man in a wide hat looks up from below. The man in the hat crouches on the pillar with one knee bent as he looks forward and says not to worry since the defenders always have the advantage over the attackers. He lowers his head under the brim of his hat with a slight grin as he says the enemy's reaction was only slightly earlier than expected. He lifts his head and places a hand on his chest and says either way it will not interfere with the great plan of darkness. Roland stands in front of the soldiers and looks down with a tense expression. Thick white webs stretch across the canyon walls as a distant figure looks up and says what this is. A wide view shows the canyon covered in massive web strands while a formation of soldiers stands below as someone questions what kind of madness this is. The canyon is filled with layered webs stretching between cliffs as large spiders move along the strands below. Jean stares into the web-covered canyon and says something about this entire place feels wrong. He explains that while fighting from the high ground is normally advantageous, digging a deep hole to build a hideout makes no sense for standard defense. Roland suggests they might have been trying to avoid exposure, but Jean quickly counters that if that were the case they should have just dug a hidden tunnel instead. Roland struggles to understand why anyone would build a fortification in such a position. Jean narrows his eyes toward the canyon below and quietly warns that this whole place could be a trap. Roland's expression immediately stiffens in confusion. A sudden thunderous impact shakes the ground as both of them look back at the same time. A violent shockwave erupts across the battlefield, throwing soldiers into the air like toys. Massive demonic beasts burst out from below and terrified voices immediately recognize one of them as a Bigfoot. The enormous monster towers over the battlefield while a giant snake beast coils around its body. The Bigfoot's immense strength alone makes it a disaster-class threat while the Salmosa carries deadly venom and armored scales. Bigfoot raises its massive hand high then slams its fist into the ground as soldiers scatter in complete panic. Its hand slides beneath a massive chunk of earth. Bigfoot roars and hurls soldiers into the air. The knights can do nothing but scream as they fall helplessly toward the canyon below. They're thrown deeper into the pit with no way to stop themselves. One terrified knight turns around just as a giant spider crawls toward him. Right behind him, a massive spider looms with glowing red eyes and gaping jaws. And he screams in pure terror. Desperate and frantic, Roland watches his men fall into the pit and orders everyone to ignore the chaos and focus on the Bigfoots first. Panicked voices call for the Holy Choir to cast support buffs while warning that the Bigfoots are far too massive to handle normally. Meanwhile, Jean only grins and tells them to bring it on. A massive foot crashes into the ground right in front of him, shattering the stone beneath it. Bigfoot lunges toward Jean alongside Salmosa while he watches without flinching. A crushing punch blasts Jean backward as the massive creature drives its fist straight into him. The nearby knights freeze in shock the moment they see him get sent flying. Roland's face pales as he desperately screams Jin's name in panic. But this beast isn't just any monster. It's the largest and strongest of the pack, with the massive serpent wrapped around its arm. Jean only smirks and reminds the creature that it picked the wrong opponent. Without hesitation, he divvies into the deep canyon with his blade drawn as the massive Bigfoot jumps after him. Jean drives his sword into the canyon wall to slow his descent. Then sprints along the wall at impossible speed. He plants his foot against the stone and calmly watches rubble and debris rain down around him. Bigfoot uses the webs to descend into the canyon at terrifying speed. Jean dodges the monster's attacks as he realizes the beast combines overwhelming strength with incredible mobility. At close range, Bigfoot's raw power alone is enough to crush almost anyone alive. And the moment the giant serpent lunges forward and spits deadly poison, Jean deflects it with his sword. But that only makes him smile wider. Because abilities like these are exactly what he's been looking for. Even while falling through the air, Jean stares at the monster with excitement and calls it absolutely delicious. His body crashes straight into a giant spider web. Jean kicks off the web and drives himself downward. He twists through the air and slams his feet against the canyon wall. Then strikes the giant serpent midair, forcing the massive creature deeper into the canyon. Purple energy wraps around Jin's hand as he calmly explains that monsters fighting together don't just combine their strength. They multiply it. Jean rushes toward the falling monster and reveals that creatures like this all share the same weakness. Bigfoot crashes onto the canyon floor as Jean explains that fighting two bodies at once is difficult even for him. He divvies down with purple energy covering his blade and points out that monsters struggle just as much moving as one. His eyes lock onto Bigfoot as he calmly explains that teamwork eventually falls apart under real danger. Bigfoot bares its fangs in fury while Jean explains that once monsters feel threatened enough, instinct takes over everything. That instinct erupts immediately as Bigfoot's fist crashes straight into the snake's head while Jean cuts past its body. Blood explodes everywhere as the serpent's head is smashed apart by its own ally. For the first time, the giant monster can only stare in complete shock at what it just did. Purple energy surges across Jin's blade as he reveals that this is exactly how you hunt two monsters at once. Jean unleashes a devastating purple slash that cuts clean through Bigfoot's neck as the creature screams in agony. Its headless body drops to its knees while blood pours from the wound. By the time the dust settles, the severed remains of both monsters lie at Jin's feet as he calmly lowers his blade. A faint smirk crosses his face as he admits. Well, still, the gatekeeper was actually pretty decent. But the purple energy around him suddenly shifts and the change immediately catches his attention. Jean slowly turns toward the corpse as a strange feeling washes over him. Purple energy swirls around the monster core while Jean questions why it feels so unsettling. He quickly shakes off the feeling and reaches down to grip the glowing blue core. With his back against the stone wall, Jean quietly consumes it as faint vibrations spread through the cavern. Suddenly, dark purple power erupts around his body and the shock leaves him completely speechless. That's when he realizes the monster's ability has been absorbed directly into him. He stares at his hand and wonders if he can now tell which monster cores carry inheritances after devouring so many of them. A grin slowly spreads across his face as he realizes just how massive this reward really is and prepares to test his new ability. A massive fireball suddenly rushes straight toward him, leaving him frozen in shock. The canyon erupts with violent explosions as the blast engulfs him in flames. A sinister laugh echoes through the canyon while a mysterious figure watches with a jagged grin. The man in the hat stands beneath the massive explosion as his laughter echoes through the cavern. He sneers at Jean for relaxing inside monster territory and calls the human completely pathetic. But the mocking expression instantly disappears. A burning figure stands inside the flames while the enemy stares in disbelief. Stone-skinned Jean emerges from the fire and says, "It's a failure." His body is now covered in a layer of gray, stone-like armor that absorbed the brunt of the blast. He stares at his hands, realizing that while it's not what he wanted, it's exactly what saved his life. The Hat Hunter stands back, watching the fire flicker around the armored hunter. He seems to be reassessing his opponent, his grin turning even wider as the situation gets more interesting. Kim Woo-jin stands tall amidst the flames, the gray scales on his skin glowing with residual heat. He's starting to realize the true potential of the stone skin he just inherited. He admits that while it wasn't the offensive power-up he desired, it seems like a pretty useful tool to have in his arsenal. He's already wondering how much more punishment this armor can take. The notification confirms that the ability is worth looking into further. He survived the first strike, but the headhunter isn't done playing yet, and the real fight is only just beginning. A massive wall of fire erupts, turning the floor of the ravine into a hellish landscape. Despite the suddenness of the attack, the hunter's focus remains unbroken. Kim Woo-jin grips the hilt of his blade, his hands now encased in the gray, textured scales of his stone skin. He prepares to counter the ambush, his body already reacting to the heat. With a powerful swing, he carves through the smoke, the force of his blade pushing back the encroaching flames. The impact creates a shockwave that rattles the surrounding cliffs. Kim Woo-jin glares at his opponent through the haze, his expression hardening. He knows that the real test has only just begun. The headhunter stares in disbelief, his eyes wide as he realizes his initial strike failed to finish the job. He never expected a human to block two of his most lethal attacks. The antagonist begins to piece together the identity of his prey, suspecting that this is the same crazy bastard known for consuming monster cores. He watches Kim Woo-jin leap through the air with predatory grace. A dark energy swirls around the headhunter as he decides to stop holding back. He hunches over, his silhouette beginning to distort. 6 massive, spindly spider legs burst from the headhunter's back, tearing through his clothing. He spreads his arms wide, fully embracing his monstrous inheritance. The two hunters clash in a blur of movement, blade meeting chitinous leg with a shower of sparks. The sheer force of the impact vibrates through the ground. They repel each other, jumping back to create distance as they size each other up once more. The terrain between them is scorched and shattered from their brief exchange. Kim Woo-jin narrows his eyes at the grotesque transformation, recognizing the signature of a spider monster's core. He realizes his opponent has also been gorging on the essence of beasts. The headhunter laughs, his voice filled with a twisted sort of joy at finding such a worthy opponent. He claims he's been looking forward to this encounter, delighted that Kim Woo-jin appeared right in front of him. He mocks the irony of the situation, his spider legs twitching with anticipation. To him, this isn't just a hunt, it's a long-awaited reunion. The antagonist's red eye glows with a manic intensity as he descends into madness. He's so thrilled by the prospect of this kill that he claims he could almost cry. Suddenly, dozens of smaller spiders drop from the cavern ceiling, crawling down the rocky walls to surround the protagonist. The headhunter isn't fighting alone, he's brought a whole hive with him. Kim Woo-jin looks up, realizing the scale of the ambush as more creatures emerge from the shadows. He's being closed in from all sides. The spiders launch a coordinated assault, spitting streams of fire and corrosive green venom. The air becomes a deadly mix of heat and acid. Kim Woo-jin spins his sword in a defensive arc, deflecting the projectiles while trying to find a way out of the kill zone. His movements are sharp, but the sheer volume of attacks is overwhelming. The hunter grinds his teeth as the fire licks at his stone skin, testing the limits of his new defense. He can feel the intense heat even through the protective scales. A massive explosion of orange and yellow fire consumes the center of the ravine, sending a pillar of smoke high into the air. The force is visible from miles away. Far above the ravine, Roland stands with his violin, his eyes widening as he sees the smoke rising from the abyss. The scale of the destruction is far beyond a simple monster hunt. Roland calls out Kim Woo-jin's name, his face etched with worry for his companion. He can only imagine the kind of fight going on down there. As the smoke and fire gradually clear, Kim Woo-jin crouches in a defensive stance at the center, both hands gripping his sword across his chest. Around him, the flames curl into roaring rings of fire, enveloping his smoke-shrouded body. The headhunter watches with morbid fascination, impressed that anyone could survive such a direct hit. He begins to wonder if calling his opponent human is even accurate anymore. He notes that Kim Woo-jin has crossed a line that most hunters never even see. The protagonist has become something else entirely through his constant consumption of monster essence. Deep cracks have formed across the stone scales on Kim Woo-jin's arms, and small chunks of the armor fall away to reveal raw, singed flesh underneath. The defensive ability is failing under the pressure. Kim Woo-jin assesses the situation, realizing that the combination of gas and fire was a tactical masterstroke. He worries that even his stone skin might not be enough to withstand another blast like that. He realizes his opponent is a high-ranking dark priest, someone who knows exactly how to exploit an enemy's elemental weaknesses. This is no longer a fight based purely on raw physical power. Blood trickles from the corner of Kim Woo-jin's mouth, but his gaze remains sharp and lethal. He acknowledges that he underestimated the capabilities of his enemy. The headhunter lunges forward with incredible speed, his spider legs pushing him across the rocky ground in an erratic, jerky motion. Kim Woo-jin barely has time to react. They clash again, the sound of metal hitting chitin echoing through the canyon. The antagonist uses his extra limbs to strike from multiple angles at once. The headhunter continues to taunt him, eager to see how the protagonist handles the frantic pace of close-quarters combat. He's enjoying the struggle, pushing Kim Woo-jin to his physical limits. He strikes from above, his weight and momentum forcing Kim Woo-jin into a defensive crouch. The air is thick with the smell of ozone and burning rock. Kim Woo-jin strains against the pressure, his muscles bulging as he holds back the headhunter's multi-armed assault. Every limb of the monster is a potential killing blow. He lets out a pained grunt as he's pushed back, his feet skidding across the uneven floor. He's struggling to maintain his footing under the relentless barrage. Purple energy flares from his blade as he tries to parry a particularly vicious strike from one of the spider legs. The two hunters are locked in a deadly dance of steel and venom. A brilliant flash of light marks another high-speed exchange, the power of their clash sending a new wave of debris flying. The sheer intensity of the fight is starting to take its toll on the cavern walls. Kim Woo-jin gasps greedily for air, his face smeared with soot and fresh blood. He realizes he is being systematically cornered by a fighter with a vastly superior tactical mind. The small spiders fire another volley of flame and acid, creating a massive combined blast that once again centers right on the protagonist. There is nowhere left for him to run. Kim Woo-jin hunkers down, crossing his arms to protect his vital organs as the explosion washes over him. He's being buried in a storm of heat and pressure. He desperately tries to formulate a plan, wondering if he should prioritize killing the spiders or focusing all his strength on the Dark Priest. He knows he can't sustain this level of damage for much longer. His internal organs are screaming in pain, and he can feel the stone skin finally reaching its absolute limit. He knows that if he doesn't change the flow of the battle now, this will be his final grave. The headhunter lunges through the smoke, his red eye gleaming with predatory intent. He laughs as he prepares to land a finishing blow on his wounded prey. Kim Woo-jin braces himself, crossing his stone-covered arms in front of his face. He can see no other option but to endure the coming impact. A massive spider leg sweeps across the frame, moving with a blur of speed that makes it nearly impossible to track. The sharp tip is aimed directly at the hunter's throat. The blow lands with sickening force, piercing deep into Kim Woo-jin's shoulders and back. Blood sprays across the rocky floor as he's pinned down by the monstrous appendages. His heavy sword clatters to the ground, no longer within reach of his trembling hands. Kim Woo-jin's body is battered and bloody, his defenses finally broken. The headhunter lets out a sharp mocking cry of triumph as he stands over his defeated opponent. He savors the moment, his face twisted into a grotesque grin. He laughs uncontrollably, the sound echoing through the ravine as his spider legs hold Kim Woo-jin in place. The antagonist is delighted by the turn of events. The headhunter looks down at his captive, his expression shifting to one of genuine curiosity. He finally understands why the others left the protagonist alone for so long. He acknowledges the skill and talent Kim Woo-jin has displayed, noting that it would be a waste to simply kill someone with such potential. He sees a reflection of his own power in the fallen hunter. Kim Woo-jin coughs up blood, his head hanging low as he struggles to remain conscious. He is completely at the mercy of the man in the wide-brimmed hat. The headhunter decides to make a special offer, his voice taking on a strangely calm and persuasive tone. He looks down at Kim Woo-jin, who has collapsed onto his knees in the dirt. He invites the protagonist to join the ranks of the Dark Priests, promising to spare his life if he agrees to use his special powers for their cause. The antagonist looms over him, silhouetted against the fire. Kim Woo-jin looks up, his gaze weary and clouded by pain, yet he listens to the offer. He is physically spent, but his mind is still processing the trap being laid for him. The headhunter leans in, his eyes glowing with an unsettling warmth. He tells Kim Woo-jin that he already knows how it feels to be special because of the unique skills he's acquired from monster cores. He gestures broadly with his spider legs, claiming that ordinary humans will never understand or accept someone like him. He argues that Kim Woo-jin's power is something they will only fear and try to forbid. The antagonist warns that the very people Kim Woo-jin protects will eventually turn on him, calling him a dark priest and trying to end his life. He paints a bleak picture of the hunter's future among humans. A memory flashes through Kim Woo-jin's mind of his time with the Order Alliance, standing alongside hunters like Roland. The Headhunter suggests that this sense of belonging is nothing more than a temporary fluke of luck. The antagonist reminds him that once they see the truth of his power, they will no longer view him as a fellow human being. He uses Kim Woojin's past experiences to fuel his argument. The Headhunter extends a hand towards the protagonist, offering a partnership born of their shared circumstances. He urges Kim Woojin to take his hand and join forces. He promises that together they can become even stronger and enjoy a level of power that ordinary men can only dream of. The Headhunter smiles, certain that his offer is too tempting for someone like Kim Woojin to refuse. Kim Woojin collapses on the charred earth, his breath coming in ragged gasps while the fires of the ambush burn around him. His stone skin has taken a beating, and the strain is clearly starting to show. He spits out a mouthful of blood, cursing his current state through gritted teeth. Despite the damage, there's still a dangerous flicker in his eyes. Even with his back against the wall, Kim Woojin can't help but mock his attacker. He looks up and asks why a clown like him feels the need to talk so much. The Headhunter's face twists in rage at the insult. He decides it's time to teach this arrogant brat a final, painful lesson. Woojin closes his eyes, sounding almost disappointed that he's being forced to resort to his last-ditch effort. He really didn't want to use this power if he could help it. But the Headhunter hasn't left him much of a choice. When his eyes snap back open, they shifted into sharp glowing slits that look completely inhuman. The crackling flames around him suddenly die down as the temperature in the abyss drops. A heavy, suffocating silence fills the area. A sudden gust of wind whips through the pit, carrying the scent of blood and ozone. The calm before the storm is officially over. The Headhunter pauses, his expression shifting from arrogance to confusion. He senses something massive shifting in the mana around them. A violent pillar of black and red energy erupts from Kim Woojin, shattering the stone floor. The shockwave tears through the abyss with raw, unchecked power. The Headhunter staggers back, desperately shielding his face from the intense heat and pressure. He can't believe the sheer scale of the energy being released. His eyes bulge in terror as he realizes what he's looking at. This isn't just a surge of power, it's a full-blown core rampage. Within the center of the storm, Kim Woojin's body begins to warp and change. The gray scales of his stone skin fuse into his muscles, becoming a permanent, monstrous armor. He glares at his opponent, telling the Headhunter to start saying things that actually make sense. The offer to join the Dark Priests was never on the table for him. The energy eruption fills the entire wide-angle view of the abyss, dwarfing everything in its path. The hunter's spider-like frame looks tiny against the massive pillar of power. Transformed and towering with clawed hands and glowing crimson eyes, Kim Woojin delivers the coldest line of the fight. He asks the hunter, how could a wolf ever serve a dog? Kim Woojin stands tall, his back covered in gray, cracked scales while red energy crackles through the air. The power radiating from him fills the cavern, marking the peak of his transformation. He turns his head slightly, his eyes glowing with an intense red light. He's finished listening to the enemy's talk, telling the hunter to at least say something that makes sense. A sudden explosion of red energy surges outward, filling the chasm with blinding light and jagged bolts of electricity. The force of the discharge shakes the entire underground structure. Woojin stands fully revealed, his skin armored in scales and his eyes burning with a predatory fire. He scoffs at the idea of submission, asking how a wolf could ever be expected to serve a dog. The Headhunter's eyes widen as he stares up at the terrifying creature Woojin has become. He can't hide his shock at the overwhelming power that was being concealed this entire time. Desperate to reclaim the advantage, the hunter commands his spider children to swarm forward and incinerate the intruder. Two of the monsters lunge in, charging up glowing orbs of elemental energy. Woojin doesn't move a muscle, his red eye narrowing as he focuses his power. He calls out the name of his ultimate technique, Heavenly Punishment. Massive pillars of crimson and black energy erupt from the floor, reaching toward the ceiling in a violent display of force. The sheer scale of the eruption dwarfs everything else in the cave. The spider minions are caught in the blast, their bodies being torn apart by the raw energy before they can even land an attack. There's no trace of them left after the initial impact. Bolts of red lightning strike down from above, turning the cavern into a landscape of fire and electricity. The floor begins to melt and crack under the intensity of the assault. The Headhunter is caught in the shockwave, his spider legs flailing as the red energy threatens to consume him as well. He's completely overwhelmed by the destructive force Woojin just unleashed. Bloodied and battered, the hunter realizes the massive gap in their strength. He can only wonder what kind of monster core Woojin could have eaten to possess this level of power. Through the dissipating red haze, Woojin's dark silhouette looms like an unstoppable force of nature. He isn't finished yet, and he begins to close the distance. Another shockwave slams into the Headhunter, sending him tumbling backward across the rocky floor. His spider limbs scramble for purchase, but the force of the blast is too much. Realizing survival is his only remaining option, the hunter's panic sets in. He knows he needs to get out of this cavern immediately before he's finished off. He turns to flee, but Wu Jin is already gone, moving faster than the eye can track. In an instant, the scaled hunter is standing right behind him, ready to strike. The Headhunter's face twists as he realizes his escape has been cut off. He didn't even see Wu Jin move, and now the predator is within arm's reach. Wu Jin's clawed hand snaps forward and latches onto the hunter's neck with crushing force. Red sparks jump between his fingers as he prepares to settle the score. With brutal efficiency, Wu Jin rips a spider leg clean off the man's back, spraying fresh blood all over the ground. He keeps a firm grip on the hunter, grinding him further into the dirt. There's no mercy in his gaze as he exerts absolute dominance over the man. Wu Jin proceeds to tear off the legs one by one, fresh blood coughing out from the Headhunter's mouth as he lets out a strangled roar. The onslaught is devastatingly ruthless, calculated to completely break the hunter's will to fight. Another powerful strike connects, sending more blood splashing against the cave walls. The hunter is barely conscious now, his 6 spider legs twitching uselessly in the air. A final slam sends the antagonist skidding across the floor, leaving a dark trail in his wake. He screams out in agony, his pride and body equally broken. Desperate and bleeding, the Headhunter raises a trembling hand and begs for a moment to speak. He's ready to negotiate, pleading with Wu Jin to just wait a second. He tries to appeal to their shared nature, pointing out that they've both consumed monster cores to gain their strength. He suggests that talking things out would be far more beneficial for both of them. Wu Jin stands over him, silent and unimpressed by the desperate plea for cooperation. He finally speaks, telling the hunter that the only help he can offer is information. He demands to know everything about the other dark priests, his glowing eyes fixed on the man at his feet. This is the only leverage the hunter has left to keep himself alive. The Headhunter is incredulous, shouting about why Wu Jin is siding with humans when he uses the same dark powers as the priests. He doesn't understand why a monster would fight for the sheep. He warns Wu Jin that the humans will eventually abandon him once they see his true form. He can't wrap his head around why someone with this much power would choose to side with the weak. Wu Jin doesn't respond to the warning, his cold reptilian eyes staring down at the hunter with absolute focus. The hunter's words mean nothing to him compared to the information he needs. Seeing no other choice, the hunter finally breaks and agrees to tell Wu Jin everything he wants to know. He starts to talk, looking for any way to stop the next blow from falling. But it's too late for talk. Wu Jin delivers one more punishing strike that sends the hunter flying back. He's finished listening to the man's desperate excuses. Wu Jin's profile is cold and stone-like as he looks down at his defeated foe. He reminds him that he only gave him one chance to talk, and that chance is now over. He unleashes a final devastating discharge of red energy directly at the Headhunter. The cavern is lit up, as the power of heavenly punishment is focused into a single lethal point. The hunter manages one last curse before the energy completely consumes him. He's vaporized in an instant, leaving nothing behind but ash and smoke. As the light fades, Wu Jin stands alone in the middle of the crater, his chest heaving. The battle is over, but the strain on his body is finally reaching its limit. The physical cost of the transformation sets in, and Wu Jin's scales begin to crack and peel away. They fall from his skin like shards of broken stone, exposing the raw flesh underneath. A thick stream of blood drips from his mouth, as the internal strain takes its toll. His body is starting to fail him after being pushed so far past its breaking point. Now back in his human form, Wu Jin looks like a wreck, with blood streaming from his eyes and mouth. He can barely stay upright as the adrenaline leaves his system. He looks toward the light, his vision blurring and his breathing coming in ragged gasps. The scale of the destruction he caused is finally apparent in the quiet aftermath of the fight. His strength completely gone, Wu Jin collapses into the center of the massive crater he created. He hits the ground with a dull thud, his body finally giving out after the ordeal. Lying on the cold stone, he stares up at the cavern ceiling with shallow, heavy breaths. He mutters to himself about how exhausting the battle was before his eyes finally drift shut. Kim Woo-jin's eyes are heavy and blood flows down his face as he struggles to stay conscious. He thinks about how using this ability even for a moment has taken a massive toll on his body. His vision blurs, focusing on the cracked stone of the crater floor as his strength fades. He knows he can't afford to fall asleep here, but his eyes are already closing. Roland and a knight reach the edge of the pit, peering down into the darkness. They spot a figure lying still at the bottom and immediately prepare to descend. Roland stares down with a look of concern, his mouth open as he calls out to the man below. He seems relieved to have found him before it was too late. Roland and the knights surround Woojin's battered body on the crater floor. He urgently orders his men to bring a stretcher over so they can move him safely. A close-up shows Roland looking down at his friend, sweat beading on his forehead. He whispers Woojin's name, checking for any signs of life. Roland looks up at the massive monster-shaped indentation on the cave wall where green blood is still dripping. He wonders just what kind of battle took place here while they were separated. The scene shifts to the third pioneer city, a sprawling fortress with high stone walls and pointed towers under a cloudy sky. Bright sunlight streams through a large window, illuminating a quiet, well-furnished bedroom. A single bed sits in the center of the room, occupied by a sleeping figure. Kim Woojin lies under the covers, his eyes slowly fluttering open as the morning light hits his face. He looks exhausted, but the immediate danger has passed. He slowly pushes himself up into a sitting position, his silhouette framed by the bright window behind him. A soft groan escapes his lips as his body protests the movement. Woojin looks down at his hands and bandaged torso, his skin marked by numerous scars from the fight. He can hardly believe that he actually managed to survive that ordeal. A maid enters the room carrying a tray, her eyes widening in surprise as she sees the patient sitting up. She nearly drops what she's holding as she realizes he's finally awake. She immediately turns and runs back out into the hallway, shouting at the top of her lungs that the mercenary has woken up. Her footsteps echo against the stone walls as she spreads the news. Roland bursts through the door a moment later, his expression one of pure excitement. He shouts out Woojin's name, reaching out a hand as he rushes toward the bed. He stands over Woojin, explaining that he's been unconscious for 3 whole days. Woojin looks back at him, still trying to process how much time has passed. Woojin's expression turns serious as he realizes the backlash of his transformation was even worse than he thought. Even with his new regeneration ability, his body needed days to recover. He looks up at Roland and asks the first question on his mind, if the expedition is finally over. Roland nods, telling him that they managed to clear out most of the surrounding rift cores. He adds that the casualties were minimal, which is a rare outcome for a mission like this. A warm smile spreads across Roland's face as he closes his eyes. He gives Woojin all the credit, saying that the success of the mission is entirely thanks to him. Woojin offers a small, confident smirk in return, suggesting that Roland should make it up to him with a generous reward. He thinks about the feeling of being acknowledged by someone else. It's a sensation he could never get tired of, no matter how many times it happens. The door opens again, and the Order Alliance representative enters the room, his hands clasped behind his back. Roland turns to see who's interrupted their conversation. The representative introduces himself with a cold, formal tone, adjusting his glasses as he looks at Woojin. He states that he's there to take a testimony regarding the expedition. He stands with 2 stern-looking guards, demanding to know exactly what kind of opponent Woojin faced. He wants every detail of the fight recorded as accurately as possible. Woojin sits back against his pillows, his expression unreadable as he listens to the man. He can feel the pressure of the interrogation starting already. The representative adjusts his glasses again, nodding that they need to keep proper records of everything that happened. He mentions that the reports from the battlefield were too chaotic to be useful. He leans in closer, his gaze sharp and suspicious. He admits that they simply couldn't believe the reports describing a battle between a single human and a monster of that scale. Woojin stares back at him, wondering if he's still under suspicion for what he did in the cave. The air in the room has suddenly become much colder. He lets out a small, tired sigh, thinking about how there's never a clean, happy ending. He finds the whole situation incredibly annoying to deal with. A close-up shows Woojin's lower face as he grits his teeth slightly. He realizes this is a serious problem and begins to wonder what kind of lie he should make up to cover his tracks. Suddenly, another man appears in the doorway, causing the representative to look back in shock. It's an old man wearing a blindfold decorated with a bizarre smiley face. The representative gasps, identifying the newcomer as Elder Bo. The elder walks into the room with a calm, authoritative presence. Elder Bo states that he will handle the matter himself, his voice firm and leaving no room for argument. The representative looks confused, asking what he means by that. The elder's face is shown in close-up, the strange, smiley face on his blindfold contrasting with his serious tone. He repeats his command with more force, he told them to get out. The representative flinches, his face turning pale as he realizes he can't win this argument. He quickly stammers out an understanding and prepares to leave. Outside, the clouds drift slowly across the sky above the city walls. The tension in the infirmary begins to dissipate as the unwanted guests retreat. Through the large window, the elder can be seen sitting on a chair next to Woojin's bed. They are finally alone, and the atmosphere in the room has shifted. Woojin speaks up, thanking the elder for the intervention. He admits he was worried about being misunderstood since he had only just woken up. He watches the old man closely, thinking about how he's been unusually interested in him ever since their first meeting. He wonders what the elder's true intentions are. Elder Bo tells him not to worry, his expression softening as he speaks. He seems to be looking at Woojin despite the blindfold covering his eyes. He tells Woojin that he has decided to trust him, regardless of what form he takes. As he speaks, he reaches into his robe to retrieve something. Elder Bo reaches into his robe, pulling out an object that begins to emit a vibrant blue glow. Kim Woojin watches him from the hospital bed, his silhouette framed by the window as he leans forward in curiosity. Woojin's face is bathed in the blue light as he looks down in shock. He seems to recognize the peculiar energy radiating from the item in the elder's grasp. Elder Bo holds up a large spherical monster core covered in numerous glowing blue eyes. Faint wisps of energy dance around the surface of the core, illuminating the room with a cold light. The elder explains that he took the core from the body of the dark priest that Woojin killed in the cave. He remains perfectly calm, his blindfold hiding any hint of his own thoughts. An extreme close-up of Woojin's blue eye shows the core's multiple eyes reflected clearly in his iris. He is speechless, realizing that the elder has just handed him a powerful and dangerous secret. Woojin takes the core in both hands, staring down at it with an intense focus. Elder Bo tells him that he secretly slipped it away because he had a feeling that Woojin might want it for some reason.